Hey everyone, welcome to Ricktopus. Today I want to argue that Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, the nihilist, the man who has spent the entire show telling everyone around him that nothing matters and caring is pointless and the universe is cold and indifferent, has been lying. Not about science, not about the multiverse, about himself, about what he actually feels underneath every layer of performance and philosophy he has spent decades building on top of the wound. And the show has been quietly proving it from the very first episode. But before we begin, I would just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It is completely free and it really does help us keep making these videos for this community we have built together. Anyway, that is enough from me. Let us get into it. The Man Before the Monster. Rick C137's Life Before the Nihilism. Rick Sanchez was not always this person. And I don't mean that in a vague, hand-wavy way. I mean it canonically, specifically. There was a version of Rick Sanchez who existed before the drinking, before the portal gun, before the endless multiverse adventures, before all of it. A version of Rick who had a wife, had a daughter, had a home, and was genuinely happy living inside the small, ordinary life he had built for himself. A version of Rick who, when given the chance to walk away from all of that and explore infinity, said no. Not because he was scared, not because he wasn't smart enough to understand what was being offered, but because he looked at what he already had and decided it was enough. That version of Rick is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about in this video. Because you cannot understand Rick's nihilism, the real kind, the deep kind, the kind that has been eating him alive for decades, without understanding what existed before it. And what existed before it was a man who believed genuinely that his life had meaning, who built that meaning quietly in a garage in Dimension C137 with the people he loved. So let's start there. Let's start with the man before the monster. For most of the show's early seasons, Rick's past is almost completely hidden. The show teases it, it drops hints, but it guards the actual truth carefully, and Rick himself is one of the biggest obstacles to finding it. He deflects constantly. He mocks anyone who tries to dig into his backstory. In one of the most telling moments in the entire series, when a character named Mr. Mimbus starts referencing details about Rick's personal life in front of the family, Rick immediately shuts it down, snapping at him for establishing canonical backstory. It's played as a joke, but the reaction is real. Rick does not want anyone knowing who he used to be, because who he used to be is the one thing he has never figured out how to make peace with. The truth about Rick's past is finally confirmed in the Season 5 finale, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack. And what it shows us is not the terrifying super genius we've spent 5 seasons watching. What it shows us is a young man who is living a completely ordinary life in a dimension called C137, in a house, with a garage, with a woman named Diane, his wife, and their daughter Beth. That's it. That's who Rick was. A family man. He was obviously brilliant. He was working on early teleportation technology in that garage, trying to figure out how to punch through dimensional barriers. The intellect was always there, but the person attached to that intellect was grounded. He had people he came home to. He had reasons to stop working and walk back inside the house. He had a life that existed outside of science, outside of adventure, outside of the multiverse. He was not yet the Rick that audiences know. He was just a man, a husband, a father, and from everything the show confirms, he was happy. This is easy to forget when you're watching Rick in his current form. The current Rick is so completely shaped by cynicism that it can be hard to imagine him ever being any other way. He speaks about love like it's a disease. He looks at anyone who shows genuine emotion and seems almost physically uncomfortable. He has built such a thick wall around whatever is actually happening inside him that most of the people who know him best, including his own family, genuinely cannot tell when he is suffering. The mask is nearly perfect. But masks don't come from nowhere. And the mask Rick wears in the show is not the mask of someone who was born cold. It is the mask of someone who was warm once and had that warmth used against them in the worst possible way. Now, the event that changed everything starts with a visit. One day, while Rick was in his garage working on his early portal technology, another Rick showed up, a version of himself from a different dimension. This This Rick had already done what Rick C137 was still only experimenting with. He had cracked the code on interdimensional travel. He had a working portal gun. He had seen the multiverse. And he came to offer Rick C137 the same thing. He wanted to share the technology. He wanted Rick C137 to join him and explore the infinite possibilities of existence alongside him. This is the moment that splits everything. Rick C137 said no. He wasn't rude about it necessarily. He just didn't want it. He looked at this version of himself standing in his garage, offering him access to infinite dimensions, infinite knowledge, infinite power. And he looked back at the house behind him, where his wife and daughter were, and he chose them. He turned down infinity for a family. He said he would rather stay where he was. Think about what that tells you about who Rick was at that point in his life. This is a man with a mind that, even then, was extraordinary. He understood exactly what was being offered to him. He could see what interdimensional travel would mean. He was not naive about it. And still, he looked at his ordinary life in one ordinary dimension and decided it was worth more to him than all of that. That is not a man who believed life was meaningless. That is a man who had found something that meant everything. The other Rick, the one we would eventually come to know as Rick Prime, did not take the rejection well. He left. And then, shortly after, he sent a bomb through a portal. The bomb came through into Rick's garage. Rick survived. He was sitting in his car at the moment it went off, and the car protected him. But Diane and Beth were not in the car. They were in the house, or nearby. The explosion killed them both, just like that. Gone. And this is the moment. This exact, specific, horrible moment that created the Rick Sanchez that the show is actually about. Here is what makes this so important to understand. The event that broke Rick was not random. It was not the universe being indifferent, the way nihilists often describe the universe. It was not a car accident or an illness or the kind of loss that happens to everyone eventually. It was targeted. It was personal. It was done deliberately by another version of himself, out of wounded pride, because Rick C137 had the audacity to say he didn't want what Rick Prime was offering. Rick's family was killed because he chose them. That is the thing that the show buries underneath all the comedy and the sci-fi spectacle and the belching and the interdimensional cable episodes. Underneath all of it is a man who made the most human choice imaginable. He chose love over power, and was punished for it in the most permanent, irreversible way possible. And here is where the nihilism comes from. Not from looking at the universe and coldly concluding that nothing matters, but from something far more painful. From looking at a universe where you made the right choice, where you did everything the way you were supposed to, where you loved your family and stayed home and said no to the dangerous path, and having that universe kill your wife and daughter. Anyway, having your one act of genuine goodness weaponized against you by a version of yourself who had no soul. When Rick eventually starts telling Morty that nothing matters, that love is just a chemical reaction, that the universe is indifferent and human lives are insignificant, he is not reporting a philosophical discovery he made through study or debate. He is reporting what his personal experience taught him. He is describing a worldview that was carved into him by grief and by the very specific horror of what happened in that garage in Dimension C137. After Diane and Beth died, Rick did not become Rick overnight. The confirmed canonical timeline shows that Rick grieved. He spiraled. He fell into a depression so severe that it took a long time before he could even function at the level needed to build a working portal gun. But eventually something shifted. Not healing exactly. More like redirection. He found a new purpose, and that purpose was finding the Rick who killed his family and making him pay for it. He built his portal gun. He left Dimension C137, and he started hunting. The Rick that the show introduces in the pilot, the one who crashes into the garage, who is already the scarred, alcoholic, impossible genius, is the product of everything that came after that moment. Decades of searching. Decades of fighting, decades of building and abandoning and destroying and running. A long, long journey from the man in the garage who chose his family over infinity to the man who eventually decided that nothing in the universe was worth caring about. But here's what never quite goes away. Here's what the show will keep returning to, over and over, no matter how hard Rick tries to bury it. The man in the garage is still in there. The one who said no to power because he had something better. The one who believed in that moment that his wife and daughter were worth more than the whole multiverse. Rick Sanchez became a nihilist because that man's choice was taken from him. But the choice itself, and what it says about who Rick actually is underneath everything he has built on top of the grief, that never disappeared. Everything that follows in this video, the drinking, the suicide attempt, the citadel, the catchphrase that means "I am in great pain, please help me," all of it is the story of a man who once believed life meant everything and spent the rest of his existence trying to convince himself and everyone around him that it means nothing. And what the show keeps quietly insisting across every season, in every crack it puts in Rick's armor, is that he never fully succeeded. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before we get to what happened next, to the bomb, to the moment that changed Rick forever, and to the specific kind of pain that turned a grieving father into the nihilist we know, we need to go back to that garage one more time. Because the details of what happened that day are darker and stranger and more specific than most people realize. Section 2. The bomb in the garage. The moment that created the nihilist. There is a version of Rick Sanchez's past that the show spent years letting you believe was fake. In the Season 3 premiere, an episode called The Rick Shank Rickdemption, Rick is captured by an alien organization called the Galactic Federation and locked inside a mental prison. His interrogator plugs into his mind and tries to extract his memories. Specifically, he is looking for the secret to how Rick built his portal gun, because that technology is the source of all of Rick's power, and the Federation wants it. And Rick shows him a memory. He shows the interrogator a young version of himself in a garage working on early portal technology. Another Rick appears, offers him the secret. Rick says no. Then Rick's wife and daughter are killed by a bomb. Rick grieves. Rick figures out the portal gun on his own, driven by the need to avenge them. It's devastating. It is one of the most emotionally heavy things the show had done up to that point. And then Rick looks at the interrogator and says the memory was completely made up. He calls it a totally fabricated backstory. He says he invented the whole thing inside his mind, specifically to distract the interrogator and buy time for a plan he was already running. The interrogator, and the audience, is left wondering whether any of it was real, whether Rick's wife was real, whether the grief was real, whether there was ever a bomb at all. For multiple seasons, the show let that question hang in the air. Rick himself refused to answer it. He deflected. He changed the subject. He got angry when people got close to it. When a character called Mr. Nimbus referenced Diane by name in front of Rick's family, Rick snapped at him immediately, furious that anyone was establishing canonical backstory out loud. It was both funny and obviously not funny at all. Rick was not joking. He genuinely did not want that door opened. The reason Rick didn't want the door opened is because everything he showed the interrogator was real. The Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, confirms it. The memory was not fabricated. The young Rick in the garage was Rick C-137. The woman was his wife Diane. The child was his daughter Beth. The other Rick who showed up was the entity who would become known as Rick Prime. The offer was real, the refusal was real, the bomb was real. Diane and Beth died exactly the way Rick showed the interrogator, in exactly the garage he described. The only part that was fabricated, the only thing Rick changed inside the memory, was the specific detail of how he figured out the portal fluid formula afterward. He adjusted that one piece to feed the interrogator false technical information. Everything else, the personal history, the loss, the grief, it was all true. Rick spent multiple seasons actively lying to the audience about whether his own pain was real, and the show waited years to correct the record. That is not an accident. That is the show telling you something about how Rick operates. He will hide his wounds, so completely, so cleverly, so convincingly that even the people watching his life unfold cannot tell what is real and what is performance. So let's go back to the garage, the real day. Rick Prime showed up while Rick C-137 was in the middle of experimenting with early portal technology. Rick Prime already had a working version of the device Rick was still building. He had crossed the dimensional barrier. He had seen the multiverse. He had access to every version of existence that could ever be imagined. And he wanted to share it. He explained how the technology worked. He invited Rick C-137 to join him. Rick said no. The show doesn't give you a long, dramatic scene here. It doesn't need to. Rick's reasoning is clear from context. He was a family man. He had Diane, he had Beth, he had a home. He had built something that mattered to him, and he was not willing to walk away from it. Not even for the most extraordinary offer imaginable. He turned down the chance to explore infinite realities because the one reality he was already living in was the one he wanted. Rick Prime left. What happens next is not something the show dwells on with long speeches or slow dramatic music. It happens quickly, almost matter-of-factly, the way real catastrophe usually does. Rick Prime, insulted by the refusal. Specifically, insulted because he interpreted Rick C-137's choice as a judgment, as Rick C-137 implying he was somehow better by not wanting what Rick Prime had, sent a bomb through a portal into Rick's garage. Rick was sitting in his car when it went off. The car protected him. He survived with injuries, but survived. Diane and Beth were not in the car. They died. And just like that, the man who had chosen love over power was left with neither. The aftermath is not something the show narrates for you directly. What it shows instead is fragments, pieces, glimpses of what Rick looked like in the years that followed, and none of it looks anything like the confident, invincible Rick that audiences meet in the pilot. After Diane and Beth died, Rick fell apart. He grieved in the way that a person grieves when they lose everyone they love at the same time, which is to say, badly and completely. He drank, he isolated. He did not immediately have some brilliant plan to track down Rick Prime. That would come later. In the immediate aftermath, he was just a man sitting in the wreckage of the life he had chosen, trying to figure out how to keep existing inside a universe that had just proven to him in the most brutal way possible that choosing right does not protect you from losing everything. The thing that eventually pulled him out of the very bottom of that grief was not healing. It was not acceptance. It was not finding peace with what happened. It was rage. It was the decision that he was going to find the Rick who did this and make him pay for it. That became his purpose. That became the thing he got up for. And having a purpose, even one built entirely out of anger and pain, was enough to get him moving again. He built his own portal gun, entirely on his own. Without Rick Prime's help, without the technical information that Rick Prime had tried to give him, Rick C-137 figured it out through his own intelligence and drove entirely by the single goal of hunting down the man who killed his family. That achievement, building a working portal gun independently, something only he and Rick Prime ever managed to do, is one of the canonical markers of just how extraordinary Rick's intelligence actually is. He built something in grief and fury that the rest of the multiverse apparently could not replicate. And then he left Dimension C-137 and started searching. Here is where the nihilism begins to take its actual shape. When Rick started hunting Rick Prime across the multiverse, he had a very specific target. He had a face. He had a memory. He had a photograph created from a scan of his own mind that showed him what Rick Prime looked like. And he began going from dimension to dimension, checking, searching, killing alternate versions of himself when they got in the way, or when he suspected they might be the one he was looking for. He killed a lot of Ricks. The show shows this in a montage in Rick Mirai Jack. Rick moving through dimension after dimension, tracking down leads that never pan out, eliminating versions of himself that turned out to be the wrong one. Over and over, for years. And he never found Rick Prime. Think about what that does to a person. You lose your family. You rebuild yourself around one goal. That goal, finding the person responsible, is the only reason you are still functioning. And then you spend years, decade after decade, chasing that goal across infinite universes and getting nothing. Every lead is a dead end. Every version of Rick Prime you find turns out to be the wrong one. The mission that was supposed to give your grief somewhere to go just keeps going, with no resolution in sight. The drinking gets worse, the cynicism deepens. Every dimension Rick visits gives him new evidence for the same conclusion that has been building since the bomb went off in his garage: that the universe does not care, that effort does not lead to justice, that the right choice does not protect you, and that meaning is something people tell themselves because the alternative is too much to sit with. Rick is not reading philosophy books and arriving at nihilism through careful reasoning. He is living through a sustained, decades-long, first-hand experience of a universe that keeps confirming the same brutal message. Nothing he does leads to the outcome he is working toward. The people he loved are gone, and the person responsible is nowhere to be found. The smartest man in the multiverse cannot find one specific Rick in an infinite sea of Ricks. And every day that passes without finding him is another day of proof that intelligence, dedication, and righteous purpose are not enough to impose meaning on a universe that does not answer to any of those things. Eventually, Rick stopped actively hunting. Not because he gave up entirely, but because the endless search with no results had ground him down to a point where he needed to do something else just to keep existing. He got involved in a resistance movement against an organization called the Galactic Federation. He made a friend called Bird Person. He built things, he destroyed things, he kept drinking, he kept moving. He built the Citadel of Ricks, a whole civilization of alternate Ricks, and then abandoned it because he hated what he had created. He fell to what might be one of the lowest points in his entire life. And then, in the specific dimension that Rick Prime had originally come from, the dimension that Prime had abandoned years earlier, leaving behind a Beth and her children with no Rick in their lives, Rick C-137 crashed his ship into a garage and passed out. That garage belonged to the family of Morty Smith. And that is where the show begins. The Rick that audiences meet in the pilot is the product of all of this. The alcoholism, the nihilism, the wall, the performance, the genius weaponized as armor, the love buried so deep he needs 3 seasons to even let it surface. All of it comes from what happened in that garage in dimension C-137 on a day when a bomb came through a portal and took away the only thing that had ever made Rick believe his life had a point. He did not arrive at the conclusion that nothing matters by thinking about it carefully. He arrived at it by living through it, by having the universe show him again and again and again that the things he chose to care about were not safe. That caring was not protection, that being right, being good, being the version of Rick who said no to power because he had something better, none of it mattered when another version of himself decided to send a bomb. The nihilism is not a pose. It is not a personality. It is the scar tissue that grew over a wound so deep that Rick has never fully let anyone see it. It is what happens when a man who genuinely believed in meaning has meaning torn out of his hands, and then spends decades in an infinite universe finding no evidence that it was ever supposed to be there in the first place. And Rick did find Rick Prime eventually. Decades later, he caught him, cornered him, and ended him. And when it was over, when the man responsible for the bomb in the garage was finally dead, Rick didn't feel the relief he had been chasing for most of his adult life. He felt nothing. Or worse than nothing. He felt the specific emptiness of a person who just realized that the thing they had organized their entire existence around was gone, and the wound it was covering was still exactly the same size it had always been. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before we can talk about what happened when Rick finally got his revenge, we need to understand what happened to him in the time between. Specifically, what happened to a man who could suddenly go anywhere in the entire multiverse, infinite dimensions, infinite versions of reality, infinite versions of every person and place and experience that has ever existed, and still couldn't find peace in any of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because the portal gun didn't just give Rick access to the universe, it showed him exactly how big the universe was. And the bigger the universe turned out to be, the more meaningless any single part of it started to feel. Section 3. Infinite dimensions, infinite meaninglessness. The portal gun as a nihilism machine. Most people, when they think about what it would feel like to travel across infinite dimensions, think about the good parts. You could go anywhere, see anything, visit every possible version of every possible world. You could find the dimension where your favorite sports team won every championship, or where a historical disaster never happened, or where you made a different choice at some critical moment in your life and ended up somewhere completely different. The idea of infinite dimension sounds at first like the greatest gift imaginable, like freedom taken to its absolute furthest point. Rick Sanchez has had that gift for decades, and it has made him one of the most miserable people in the entire multiverse. That is not a coincidence. The portal gun is not just a tool Rick uses to get from place to place. It is the physical object that most completely represents his nihilism. And it is also one of the primary reasons that nihilism became impossible for him to escape. Because what the portal gun actually does, when you think about what it means to have one and use it the way Rick uses it, is turn every single dimension into something disposable. It makes everywhere interchangeable. It makes every version of every person replaceable. It makes consequences, in the most literal sense, optional. And when consequences become optional, meaning starts to dissolve. Not all at once, slowly. Dimension by dimension, over years and decades, until the man holding the portal gun can look at an entire civilization and feel nothing at all. To understand what the portal gun actually does to a person philosophically, you have to look at one specific episode early in the show. Season 1, Episode 6. Rick Potion number 9. The basic setup is simple. Morty asks Rick to make him a love potion so that his high school crush will fall for him at a school dance. Rick makes it. Morty uses it. It goes wrong almost immediately. The potion spreads beyond Morty's crush and infects the entire school. Then it spreads further. Then Rick tries to fix it, which makes things dramatically worse. Through a chain of increasingly bad decisions and failed corrections, every human being on Earth, except for Rick's immediate family, gets mutated into a monstrous creature that is obsessed with Morty. The situation is irreversible. There is no going back. Earth, the entire planet, the entire civilization, every person they have ever known outside their house is gone, destroyed. Not by a villain, not by some cosmic catastrophe, by a love potion that Rick made in his garage because his 14-year-old grandson had a crush on a girl. Any reasonable person would expect this to be the darkest, most catastrophic moment the show could possibly produce. A point of no return. The kind of loss that a story would spend many episodes processing and grieving. What Rick actually does is look up a dimension where an alternate version of himself already solved the problem, then checks whether that version of Rick and Morty died shortly after solving it. They did. Rick lands the ship next to the bodies, hands Morty a shovel, and tells him to start digging. They bury their own corpses in the backyard of the house. They walk inside. Rick opens the fridge, grabs a drink, and life continues. The entire dimension they came from, every person they ever knew, is simply left behind. Like a hotel room you check out of and never think about again. This is the portal gun's effect on meaning made completely visible. Because Rick has the ability to leave and start over in a new dimension, the loss of an entire world becomes a logistical problem rather than a tragedy. He doesn't have to grieve it. He doesn't have to sit with it. He just points the portal gun at a new version of reality and steps through. The consequences of what happened in the old dimension simply stop applying to him the moment he crosses over. And Morty, who does not yet have Rick's decades of practice at this, is absolutely shattered by it. The episode ends with him sitting in the backyard of a house that belongs to a version of his family that is not quite his, staring at the freshly dug grave that contains his own body, listening to music playing from inside while Rick acts like nothing unusual happened. Morty's face in that moment is the face of someone who just had a fundamental assumption about how the world works ripped away from them without warning. That assumption is this: that the things you do have permanent weight, that the world you live in cannot simply be discarded, that the people around you are not interchangeable, that there is something specific and irreplaceable about the particular version of reality you inhabit. Rick stopped believing that a long time ago. The episode is showing you what it looks like when someone who still believes it gets their first real lesson from someone who doesn't. The abandonment of Dimension C-137 in that episode is not a one-time thing. It is a pattern. And the pattern reveals something important about the specific kind of damage the portal gun does to the person carrying it. When you can always leave, you never fully have to commit to where you are. When you can always find an alternate version of a person, you never fully have to accept the loss of a specific one. When you can always locate a dimension where things went differently, you never fully have to reckon with the consequences of how things went here. The portal gun is a machine for avoiding permanence, and permanence is what gives things weight. It is what makes a moment matter. It is what makes a relationship real rather than just convenient. Rick has been carrying a portal gun and living by its logic for decades. He has visited more dimensions than any other Rick in the multiverse. He has seen more versions of reality, more versions of people he knows, more variations on every possible situation than any being in existence. And what that has done to him is make it nearly impossible to feel the specific gravity of any single thing, any single place, any single person, because his entire lived experience keeps telling him that there is always another version just through the next portal. This is one of the cruelest parts of Rick's situation. The very thing that makes him powerful, the portal gun, the access to infinity, is also one of the primary things that keeps him trapped in nihilism, because every time he might start to feel that something is real, that something has weight, the knowledge of the infinite alternatives is right there. It is very hard to believe that this specific version of anything is irreplaceable when you have personally visited 40 other versions of it. The show gives you the clearest possible image of how Rick thinks about the universes he passes through in an episode from Season 2 called The Ricks Must Be Crazy. In that episode, Rick takes Morty inside the battery that powers his flying car to show him how it works. What is inside the battery is not a chemical reaction or a stored charge. It is an entire civilization. A miniature universe with its own planets, its own intelligent life, its own history and culture and people who have built societies and art and meaning over thousands of years of their own time. All of it exists inside a small cylindrical battery, and all of it exists for one purpose: to generate the electricity that powers Rick's car. These people do not know this. They believe they are living their lives. They have religions and governments and hopes for the future. They have children and parents and losses and loves. And from Rick's perspective, looking down at all of it, they are a power source, a convenient one he created specifically to serve a function, and one he feels almost nothing about beyond mild irritation when they stop producing enough electricity. This is not presented as Rick being uniquely evil. It is presented as the logical endpoint of a perspective that sees the universe in purely practical terms. If nothing has inherent meaning, if no civilization is more valuable than any other, if the universe is, as Rick says at one point, basically just an animal that grazes on the ordinary and creates things only to consume them, then a civilization inside a battery is not meaningfully different from a civilization on a planet. They are both just arrangements of matter that last for a while and then stop. The horror of that scene is not that Rick built a civilization inside a battery. The horror is how completely ordinary it seems to him, how little he has to work to justify it to himself. The logic of nihilism, taken all the way to its conclusion, leads you exactly there. If nothing matters, then the people in the battery don't matter either. And if the people in the battery don't matter, then neither do the people in any other dimension. And if the people in any other dimension don't matter, then neither does Morty, neither does Beth, neither does anyone. Rick does not fully live at that conclusion. The rest of this video will show you the many ways he contradicts it. But the fact that he can create a civilization inside a battery and use it to power his car without it costing him much emotionally, that is the portal gun's philosophy made physical. That is what decades of treating dimensions as disposable actually looks like when it reaches its natural end. There is one more piece of the portal gun's relationship with nihilism that is worth understanding before we move forward. And it is the most deliberately constructed piece of all, because it turns out that Rick did not just let the multiverse happen to him, he shaped it, he edited it. He built a filter around the entire collection of accessible dimensions specifically designed to protect one thing: his own sense of relevance. This is confirmed in Rick Mirai Jack, and it is called the Central Finite Curve. It is essentially a wall Rick built around the portion of the multiverse that he and other Ricks could access through their portal guns. And the specific function of that wall was to limit travel to only those dimensions where a version of Rick Sanchez, is the smartest being in the universe. Let that sink in for a moment. Rick had access to the infinite multiverse, every possible version of reality. Dimensions where beings exist that make Rick look ordinary, where intelligences operate that he could not begin to match, where he would be completely unremarkable. And rather than engage with those dimensions, he walled them off. He curated the accessible multiverse so that in every version of reality any Rick could visit, a Rick was always the most powerful, most intelligent entity in the room. On the surface, this looks like ego, and it is partly ego. But underneath the ego is something more desperate and more sad. It is a man who, having lost everything that gave his life meaning on a personal level, fell back on the one thing he had always had, his intelligence, and built an entire cosmic architecture around protecting it. Because if Rick is always the smartest person in any dimension he can reach, then at least that one thing is permanent. At least that one thing cannot be taken away. At least somewhere in the infinite meaningless universe, Rick Sanchez means something, even if that something is just being the smartest. This is nihilism folding back on itself in the most interesting way. Rick tells everyone, constantly, that nothing matters. And then, he secretly rigs the multiverse so that he always matters most. The man who says meaning doesn't exist spent enormous effort manufacturing a very specific kind of meaning for himself and hiding it behind an architecture most people don't even know exists. When the Central Finite Curve is eventually destroyed in the Season 5 finale, blown apart by evil Morty, who wanted to escape the portion of the multiverse where every Rick is always the most important person in the room, Rick is left without that protection. For the first time. Suddenly there are infinite dimensions he could travel to where Rick Sanchez is nobody, where he is ordinary, where the armor he built for himself over decades means nothing. It is one of the few moments in the show where Rick looks genuinely lost rather than just tired or drunk or performing indifference. Because the Central Finite Curve was not just a clever trick. It was the last structural defense he had built against the full weight of the nihilism he claims to have accepted. What the portal gun created, over decades of use, is a man who has seen too much of the universe to be comforted by any single part of it. Every dimension he visits adds to a mental archive of alternatives that makes the one he is currently in feel like just another entry in a very long list. Every person he meets is shadowed by every other version of that person he has encountered across infinite realities. Every moment of genuine feeling is immediately contextualized by the knowledge that, in another dimension, that moment is playing out differently. This is the thing the show keeps returning to underneath all the comedy and the action and the gross-out jokes. Rick is not nihilistic because he is cold. He is nihilistic because he is a man carrying the weight of infinite worlds, and infinite worlds is a weight that eventually makes any single world feel very light. The portal gun gave him everything, and everything, it turns out, is one of the loneliest things a person can have. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But here is the interesting thing. For all the damage the portal gun did, for all the ways it deepened and reinforced and gave shape to Rick's nihilism, it is not the thing that reveals that nihilism most clearly to the people watching the show. That job belongs to something much smaller. Something Rick says every day, loudly, in moments of joy and chaos and ordinary life that most people hear as nonsense and almost nobody hears as a confession. And it has been hiding in plain sight since the very first season. Section 4. Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, the catchphrase that screams for help. There is a moment in the very first season of Rick and Morty where Rick invents his own catchphrase on purpose. Not discovers it, not falls into it naturally over time the way most characters develop their signature phrases. He sits down, decides he wants one, and creates it. The phrase he lands on is Wubba Lubba Dub Dub. He announces it like a product launch. He even references a real television personality from the late 1980s named Arsenio Hall, who was famous for getting his studio audiences to make a loud whooping noise on cue. Rick is doing the same thing, essentially. He is giving himself a noise to make, a performance, a sound that signals to everyone around him that Rick Sanchez is having a good time, and things are going well, and there is nothing here worth worrying about. The show plays this completely straight as a joke. It is funny. The idea of a genius scientist sitting down and deliberately manufacturing a catchphrase for himself is absurd in exactly the way Rick and Morty is supposed to be absurd. Audiences laughed. The phrase took off. It became one of the most recognizable things about the show. Printed on merchandise, quoted everywhere, repeated endlessly by fans who loved the energy of it. A nonsense phrase that somehow captured something about Rick's chaotic, unpredictable presence. And then, a few episodes later, the show quietly detonated it. In Season 1, Episode 11, called Ricksy Business, Rick throws a party at the family house while Beth and Jerry are away. The party, as Rick's parties tend to do, spirals completely out of control. In the middle of all the chaos, Morty ends up in a conversation with one of Rick's closest friends, a being called Bird Person. Bird Person is exactly what the name suggests. A tall, humanoid creature with the features of a bird, who speaks slowly and seriously, and is one of the few beings in the multiverse that Rick genuinely respects and trusts. Morty mentions Rick's catchphrase to Bird Person. Maybe he says it, maybe he asks about it, but the subject comes up. And Bird Person responds with something that completely reframes every single time Rick has ever said it. In Bird Person's language, the language of his people, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub is not nonsense. It is not a cheerful sound or a piece of absurdist comedy. It is a real phrase with a real meaning. And the meaning is this: I am in great pain, please help me. That is it. That is what Rick has been saying, loudly, enthusiastically, in moments of triumph and celebration and ordinary daily life, every single time the phrase has come out of his mouth. Not a joke, not a random collection of syllables, a direct statement of suffering, dressed up in sounds that make it completely unrecognizable to anyone who does not know the language. Morty's response to this information is to say that Rick must be saying it ironically. And the scene moves on. The party continues. The revelation is dropped into the middle of a chaotic episode and left there without a spotlight on it, without a dramatic musical sting, without anyone stopping to say out loud how significant that actually is. The show tells you something devastating and then immediately lets the noise of everything else wash over it. That is entirely intentional, because that is exactly what Rick does with his own pain. Let's think about what it actually means that this is Rick's catchphrase. Not a catchphrase he stumbled into, one he chose. He sat down and picked it. He modeled it on the kind of performative energy that television personalities use to get crowds excited and engaged and happy. He built a phrase specifically designed to read as celebration, as fun, as someone who is fully present and having a great time. And the phrase he chose, whether consciously or not, means, I am in great pain, please help me. There are a few ways to read this. The first is that Rick genuinely did not know what the phrase meant in Bird Person's language when he created it. That it was truly random sounds that happened to mean something devastating in one specific alien language. And the darkness of the translation is a coincidence that the show is using for thematic effect. This reading is fine. It still works. Because even if Rick didn't know what the words meant, the show is using them to tell you something about what is happening underneath his surface at all times. The catchphrase functions as a window the audience has that Rick himself might not. The second reading is more interesting. Rick is one of the smartest beings in the multiverse. He speaks multiple languages, he interacts with alien civilizations constantly. Bird Person is his closest friend. It would be surprising, to say the least, if Rick spent significant time around Bird Person and his culture and somehow never learned what this phrase meant in their language. The possibility that Rick picked the phrase knowing exactly what it meant in Bird Person's tongue, and then used it as his public signature, his loudest and most performed expression, his way of announcing himself in any room, is very much on the table. If that is true, then what Rick built was a confession so well disguised that it functions as its opposite. He found a way to say, I am in great pain, please help me, out loud, in public, in front of everyone who knows him, every single day, and made it so unrecognizable as a cry for help that the people hearing it respond with laughter and excitement. He turned his suffering into a crowd pleaser. He made his darkest statement his most entertaining one. He built the perfect hiding place for his pain, directly inside his own public persona, and then performed it constantly. That is not the behavior of someone who has accepted nihilism and moved on. That is the behavior of someone who is drowning and has found an incredibly creative way to ask for a life jacket while making absolutely sure that nobody realizes that is what they are doing. The catchphrase is the most compressed example of something the show does with Rick constantly across every season in ways both small and large. Rick hides things inside performances. He buries genuine feeling inside behavior that makes it invisible. He takes what is actually happening inside him and wraps it in so many layers of humor, aggression, genius, and deliberate misdirection that even the people who love him can rarely find it. Think about how many times across the show Rick says something that sounds like a joke and functions as a joke, but contains, somewhere inside it, something completely real. Think about how many of his speeches about the meaninglessness of the universe land as comedy because of the way he delivers them and the context they appear in, while also being exactly what he actually believes. Rick has perfected the art of saying true things in ways that allow everyone around him to receive them as entertainment rather than confession. The Wubba Lubba Dub Dub reveal is the show making this pattern explicit for the audience. It is pointing directly at the mechanism and saying, look at how this works. Here is a man who has found a way to perform suffering as joy. Here is a man whose public face and private reality are so far apart that his literal cry for help has become his most beloved and celebrated characteristic. Here is someone who has been telling you he is in great pain since the very beginning of the show, and the only reason you missed it is because he made it funny. Morty's line, "I got news for you," he's saying it ironically, is worth paying attention to as well. Because Morty is wrong. But Morty's wrongness here is not stupidity. It is self-protection. If Rick is saying it ironically, then there is nothing to respond to. If Rick is saying it ironically, then Morty does not have to sit with the weight of what it would mean if Rick is not. Choosing to believe that Rick's pain is a performance is easier and less frightening than choosing to believe that the performance is covering real pain. Morty does what most of us would do. He finds the interpretation that requires less of him and holds on to it. Rick built his catchphrase to make that exact choice available to everyone around him. He constructed it so that saying it ironically would always be the path of least resistance for anyone who heard it. The people who love Rick, the people who know him, the audience watching him, all of us can look at Wubba Lubba Dub Dub and laugh and feel like we are in on the joke. Because Rick made us a joke to be in on. He gave us a comfortable way to receive information that, if we received it straight, would require us to do something about it. The nihilism and the catchphrase are connected in a very specific way that goes beyond just Rick hiding his emotions. They are both expressions of the same underlying strategy. Make the truth loud enough and public enough and entertaining enough that nobody takes it seriously. When Rick tells Morty that nobody exists on purpose, that the universe is meaningless, that caring about things is a chemical illusion that evolution uses to make organisms breed, he is not lying. He genuinely believes these things, or at least a part of him does. The part that was built by everything that happened after the bomb in the garage. But he is also delivering these beliefs in a way that is designed to prevent them from landing with their full weight. He wraps them in burps and alien adventures and absurd scenarios and the general chaos of Rick's presence, so that the philosophy is always slightly cushioned by comedy. Wubba Lubba Dub Dub works the same way. The pain is real. The phrase is a direct expression of it. But the expression is so strange, so energetic, so completely separated from what anyone expects genuine suffering to sound like, that it passes through the room without touching anyone. Rick has figured out that if you want to tell people something devastating, the safest way to do it is to make it entertaining. Entertainment is the thing that keeps everyone comfortable. And keeping everyone comfortable means keeping everyone at a distance. And keeping everyone at a distance means the wound never gets seen directly, which means it never has to be treated. which means Rick never has to stop and face what is actually happening inside him. The catchphrase is, in this way, one of the most nihilistic things Rick does. Not because it is dark, but because it is a solution. It is a system Rick built for managing his pain without addressing it. It is proof that for all his stated belief that nothing matters, Rick has invested significant creative energy into managing the way his suffering is perceived by others. A person who truly believed nothing mattered would not bother building that system. They would not care whether their pain was visible or hidden. The fact that Rick cares, the fact that he worked to make his cry for help unrecognizable as one, reveals that there are things he is protecting, things he is not willing to fully expose. A self that, underneath all the performance, still has enough weight that it needs guarding. The phrase itself fades from the show as the seasons progress. Rick uses it less and less. By the later seasons, it is almost gone. And this is worth noting because it mirrors something else that happens with Rick across the show. The gradual and reluctant cracking of the wall between his performance and his actual interior life. As Rick is forced, season by season, to confront real things, the reality of his backstory, the truth about his feelings for the people around him, the hollow ending of his decades-long revenge quest, the need for the catchphrase as a shield becomes slightly less overwhelming. Not gone. Rick never fully drops the armor. But the specific tool of Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, the perfectly constructed, maximally entertaining, completely undetectable cry for help, gets used less as time passes. As though something in Rick, very slowly and very reluctantly, starts to find other ways to exist with what is inside him. Or at least, stops needing to shout it in a language nobody understands quite as frequently. The reveal of what the phrase means did not change anything in the immediate story. Life at the party continued. Rick kept drinking. The episode resolved. Nobody held an intervention. Nobody asked Rick directly whether he was okay. Because he built it so that nobody would. That was the whole point. The phrase was designed to pass through the room without stopping. And it did. And it has. Every single time. But it was said. That is the thing. Every time Rick shouted it across the years of the show, in all the chaos and comedy and adventure, it was said. The truth was in the room. It was just dressed up too well for most people to see it. And the more you understand about what happened to Rick in that garage in Dimension C-137, the more the phrase sounds less like a joke and more like a man quietly screaming in a language he chose precisely because no one around him would understand. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The catchphrase is the most visible example of Rick using performance to hide pain. But it is far from the only one. In fact, the show builds an entire second layer of this same idea around one of its most beloved and celebrated episodes. An episode about a man who turns himself into a vegetable to avoid a single conversation. And what that absurd, brilliant, completely unnecessary transformation actually says about what Rick is running from and why he will go to any lengths, including lengths that make absolutely no rational sense, rather than sit still long enough to feel it. Section 5. The Bottle. Rick's alcoholism as philosophical surrender. Rick Sanchez is almost never without a drink. This is not an exaggeration. Watch any episode of Rick and Morty and pay attention to Rick's hands, or his coat pocket, or the workbench in his garage. There is almost always a flask somewhere. A bottle. A container of some alien liquid that functions the way alcohol functions, as something Rick puts into his body constantly, in every situation, under every circumstance, regardless of what is happening around him. He drinks while operating his spaceship. He drinks while performing what amounts to open surgery on living creatures. He drinks while talking to his family, while running from galactic law enforcement, while building world-altering technology in his garage at 3 in the morning. He drinks in alien prisons. He drinks at the breakfast table. He drinks in the middle of conversations where the people he is talking to are clearly in distress and need him to be present. The drinking is so constant that it is easy to stop seeing it. It becomes part of the background of who Rick is, like his white hair or his lab coat or the green tint around his mouth. Just another feature of the character rather than a detail that means something. The show is partly responsible for this. It presents the drinking casually, matter-of-factly, often as the backdrop to something funnier or more dramatic happening in the foreground. Rick is always drunk. That is just Rick. Move on. But the drinking is not just Rick. It is one of the most important things the show is saying about him. And the episode that makes this most clear is also, on its surface, one of the silliest episodes the show ever produced. Season 3, Episode 3. Pickle Rick. The setup is this. The Smith family has a therapy appointment scheduled with their family therapist, Dr. Wong. All 4 of them are supposed to go. Beth, Summer, Morty, and Rick. On the morning of the appointment, Morty goes to the garage to get Rick and finds him lying on his workbench, having turned himself into a pickle. A literal pickle. A small, green, cylindrical vegetable. Rick announces this with enormous enthusiasm, seemingly delighted by his own ingenuity. He cannot go to therapy, he explains, because he is a pickle. He is Pickle Rick. The episode that follows is genuinely spectacular in terms of pure action and creativity. Rick, as a pickle with no arms or legs, gets knocked into a sewer drain by a neighborhood cat. He then uses the biology of the sewer creatures around him, cockroaches, rats, to build himself a functioning body out of animal parts, eventually escaping the sewer, infiltrating a foreign government building, taking out an entire security apparatus using improvised weapons made from whatever he can find, and surviving the whole experience through a combination of extraordinary intelligence and absolute refusal to accept defeat, even in the most absurd circumstances imaginable. It is one of the most purely entertaining things the show has ever done. The Pickle Rick sequence is inventive and funny and impressive, and it works completely on its own terms as an action comedy set piece. The audience loved it. It became one of the most memed and referenced moments in the show's history. People still quote it. Pickle Rick became a cultural phenomenon in a way that very few moments from animated television managed to achieve. And the whole thing is a metaphor for alcoholism. Confirmed, directly, by the show's creator. Dan Harmon, one of the 2 people who created Rick and Morty, gave an interview where he explained what Pickle Rick was actually about. He said that the episode is, at its core, about Rick's alcoholism. The act of pickling, specifically the phrase pickling your liver, which is a well-known way of describing what heavy drinking does to the body over time, is the central image the episode is built around. Rick literally pickles himself. He submerges himself in a substance that preserves and distorts the thing it contains. He chooses to become a pickle, rather than be a person for one morning. The metaphor is right there on the surface, and Harmon's point was that he made it so obvious that it would vanish into the comedy. Harmon also pointed out something that, once you notice it, is impossible to ignore. Pickle Rick is the only episode in the entire run of Rick and Morty where alcohol is not mentioned. At all. Not once. No flask, no bottle, no reference to drinking, no moment where Rick takes a sip of something. In a show where Rick's drinking is present in virtually every other episode, the one episode that is entirely about his alcoholism is the one episode where the drinking disappears completely. Harmon said he noticed this while putting the script together and made the choice to keep it that way. He removed any remaining references to drinking on purpose. The episode is so much about alcoholism that it did not need to mention alcohol once. What that means is that everything you see Rick doing as a pickle, the extraordinary effort, the brilliance applied to escaping an impossible situation, the sheer stubborn refusal to sit still for even a moment, is what the drinking looks like from the inside. Rick will perform miracles of intelligence and creativity rather than stop moving long enough to feel what is underneath the motion. He will turn himself into a vegetable. He will fight through a sewer. He will take down an entire building full of armed guards using improvised tools. He will do literally anything and do it with apparent enthusiasm rather than sit in a room with a therapist for 1 hour, because the therapist would make him stop. And stopping means feeling. And feeling means confronting what is at the bottom of all the motion and all the noise and all the drinking. And what is at the bottom is something Rick has been running from for decades. The therapy scenes in Pickle Rick are genuinely some of the most important scenes the show has ever written, and they are worth looking at closely. Dr. Wong, the family therapist, is played completely straight. She is not a joke. She is not a caricature of a therapist. She is a calm, intelligent, perceptive professional who says things that are completely accurate and completely difficult to hear. And she says them without cruelty and without drama, which somehow makes them land harder than if she had been aggressive about it. When Rick finally does end up in her office at the end of the episode, still technically a pickle, now rebuilt with a body made of animal parts and holding a martini glass, she does not treat him like a genius, or a patient to be impressed by, or a problem to be solved. She treats him like a person who is avoiding something, and she names what he is avoiding with complete clarity. She tells Rick that the reason he turned himself into a pickle is the same reason he does all the extraordinary things he does. Not because he enjoys them, or not only because he enjoys them, but because they give him an excuse not to be present, not to be still, not to sit in a room with his family and talk about how they actually feel and what they actually need from each other. She says that the intelligence Rick uses to escape every situation, including the situation of having normal human emotions, is not helping him. It is just helping him avoid. Rick's response to this is to tell her she is very smart. He acknowledges that she is right. He even says that he knows everything she is saying is true. And then he leaves. He gets up, walks out, and the episode ends with the family in the parking lot and Rick having admitted to a therapist that he understood exactly what she was telling him, and then chose to continue exactly as he was. This is not a moment of failure. It is a moment of extreme precision, because Rick understanding something and Rick being willing to change based on that understanding are two completely different things. Rick's intelligence has never been the obstacle. He has always been able to see clearly what is happening inside him. The obstacle is that seeing it clearly is not, for Rick, the same as being willing to do anything about it. Understanding the problem is just another thing his mind can do. It does not automatically translate into action or healing or change. This is where the alcoholism and the nihilism connect at their root. If nothing matters, then getting better doesn't matter either. If the universe is meaningless, and all effort is ultimately pointless, and every version of happiness is just a chemical reaction that evolution designed to keep organisms functioning long enough to reproduce, then why would Rick go to therapy? Why would he stop drinking? Why would he put in the effort to address the wound that has been driving his behavior for decades? The nihilism is not just a philosophy Rick holds about the universe in the abstract. It is the specific belief system that makes self-destruction feel logical rather than harmful. Rick drinks because he is in pain. That is the simple version. But the more complete version is that Rick drinks because he is in pain, and he has constructed an entire worldview that makes addressing that pain seem pointless. He has built a philosophical framework in which the most rational response to suffering is not to heal from it, but to manage it, to survive it, to keep moving through it with the help of whatever chemical assistance is available. Because healing implies that there is a better state to heal toward. And a man who believes nothing matters, at least on the surface, is not supposed to believe in better states. The drinking is surrender dressed up as function. It is Rick deciding over and over every day that the cost of stopping is higher than the cost of continuing. That facing what is at the bottom of the bottle is more dangerous than what the bottle is doing to him. That the numb, slightly blurred version of existence that the alcohol provides is preferable to the sharp, clear, fully felt version that he would have access to if he stopped. And the show, across all its seasons, keeps showing you the consequences of that decision without ever editorializing about them heavily. It does not lecture Rick. It does not have characters give speeches about how he should stop drinking. It simply shows you a man who is extraordinarily capable of almost everything and almost completely incapable of sitting still with his own interior life. A man who can build a portal gun from grief and fury, but cannot make it through a single therapy appointment without turning himself into a vegetable first. The canonical confirmation of Rick's alcoholism as a genuine and serious condition, rather than a running joke, shows up in multiple places beyond just Pickle Rick. After the events of that episode, it is confirmed that Rick begins regularly seeing Dr. Wong for therapy sessions. He does not go eagerly. He does not go and suddenly transform into a healed and open person. but he goes. The fact that he goes at all, given everything the show has established about Rick's relationship with stillness and vulnerability and being seen clearly by another person, is actually significant. It does not fix him. But it is evidence that somewhere underneath all the performance, some part of Rick knows that what he is doing is not sustainable forever. There is also the matter of what happens after Rick finally kills Rick Prime in Season 7, an event that removes the one organizing purpose that Rick has been building his life around for decades. Without the revenge quest, without the target, without the mission that gave the drinking and the movement and the chaos a direction to aim toward, Rick falls back into his depressive state almost immediately. The show confirms this directly. He loses his sense of purpose. He spirals. The very same patterns that define the worst years of his life after Diane and Beth died begin reasserting themselves. The drinking is not a feature of the adventure. It is what is there when the adventure stops. It is the baseline Rick returns to every time the thing keeping him in motion is taken away. That is what makes it not just a habit, but a philosophy in practice. The bottle is how Rick inhabits his nihilism physically. It is the daily, repeated, embodied act of agreeing with the belief that nothing is worth protecting, including himself. Every drink is a small vote for the worldview that says caring about your own well-being is as meaningless as caring about anything else. And yet, the show does not let even this be entirely clean. Because Rick, for all his drinking, for all his deliberate self-destruction, keeps showing up. He keeps getting in the ship with Morty. He keeps going back to the garage. He keeps building things and caring about outcomes even when his stated belief is that outcomes do not matter. He sits in Dr. Wong's office and tells her she is right and then leaves. Yes, but he was in the office. He came back after Pickle Rick. He kept the appointment, at least eventually. The alcoholism is real. The self-destruction is real. But so is the part of Rick that keeps dragging himself back into the world every morning, flask in hand, looking for the next thing that will give the day enough shape to survive it. The nihilism says stop. The man keeps going. That tension between the philosophy Rick performs and the behavior Rick actually exhibits is something the show explores most nakedly in the episode we are about to discuss. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because as dark as the drinking is, and as clearly as Pickle Rick articulates what is underneath it, there is one night in Rick's story that does not involve performance or philosophy or clever metaphors at all. One night where the wall came completely down, where Rick, alone in his garage, made a decision that had nothing to do with adventure or intelligence or any of the things he hides behind. One night where the pain underneath everything else became the only thing in the room. And it is one of the darkest moments in the entire show. Section 6. Autoerotic Assimilation. The night Rick almost ended it. There is a version of Rick Sanchez that almost nobody gets to see. Not the version that burps through interdimensional adventures. Not the version that builds incredible technology in an afternoon and treats the achievement like it barely deserves a shrug. Not the version that gives speeches about how nothing matters and the universe is cold and meaning is something small minds invented to feel better about their small lives. Not the performer. Not the genius. Not the most interesting person in any room he has ever walked into. The version almost nobody gets to see is the one that exists after the performance stops, after the adventure ends. After the last person has gone home and the noise has died down and Rick is alone in his garage with nothing between him and whatever is actually happening inside him. That version of Rick is the one the show reveals at the end of Season 2, Episode 3, in an episode called Autoerotic Assimilation. And what it reveals is not comfortable to watch, even within a show that is frequently uncomfortable on purpose. This episode contains the single darkest moment in the show's history. Not the most violent, not the most philosophically heavy, the darkest. In the specific sense of the word, that means closest to the absolute bottom of what a person can feel. And it arrives at the end of an episode that, for most of its running time, looks like it is about something else entirely. The episode begins with Rick, Morty, and Summer discovering a hijacked spaceship that turns out to be under the control of a hive mind. A hive mind, in the show's terms, is a single consciousness that has spread itself across many individual bodies, controlling all of them simultaneously, while each body goes about its own physical existence. The hive mind they encounter is named Unity, and Unity is not a stranger to Rick. Unity is his ex. This is one of the show's most creative pieces of writing. Rick's former romantic partner is not a single person, but an entity that exists as thousands of people at once, spread across an entire planet. And Rick's reaction to seeing Unity again is immediate and genuine. He lights up. The wall drops. He is visibly, unambiguously happy, in a way that the show rarely allows him to be. And the happiness is not performed for anyone's benefit. There is no audience in the moment when Rick realizes who he is dealing with. It is just Rick, and the response is real. What follows is essentially a vacation. Rick throws himself into the reunion with Unity completely. Unity, able to operate through any body on the planet it currently inhabits, can be anywhere and anyone simultaneously. Rick and Unity spend time together in ways that the show depicts with a mixture of comedy and genuine warmth. And throughout all of it, Rick seems lighter than he ever does in ordinary life. Less defended, less armored, more present. Summer and Morty watch this with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. They have never seen Rick like this. The Rick they know keeps everyone at arm's length through a combination of genius, aggression, and sheer overwhelming presence. The Rick they are watching with Unity seems, for a few hours, like someone who does not need all of those defenses. Someone who has found the one context in which being Rick Sanchez is not a performance, but just an experience he is having. Then Unity leaves. Rick comes back to the place they have been staying together to find Unity gone. Every body Unity was inhabiting on the planet is just standing around, no longer animated by a single shared consciousness, just individual people going about their lives. Unity itself is nowhere. What it has left behind is a note. The note, which Rick reads alone, explains that Unity had to leave, that it cares for Rick genuinely, that the time they spent together was real and meaningful to Unity, but that being with Rick is something Unity cannot continue to do. Not because Rick is not extraordinary, but because Rick's chaos, his self-destruction, his endless motion, and his refusal to be still pulls Unity backward rather than forward. Unity says that Rick makes it regress, that when Unity is with Rick, it becomes worse rather than better. And Unity needs to grow, so it is leaving. Unity does not leave because Rick is too much of a bad person. It leaves because Rick is too much of a broken one. That is a very specific distinction, and it is one that cuts differently. Being left because you are evil is something a person can construct a story around. Being left because your damage is contagious, because the person who loves you cannot be around you without being harmed by it, because your inability to heal has become something that spreads to the people closest to you, that is not a story that has a comfortable shape. That is just loss with no redemption attached to it. Rick reads the note alone. The camera stays with him. And then Rick does what Rick does when he has no performance left to give and no adventure to throw himself into and no noise loud enough to drown out the specific silence of being completely, absolutely alone. He goes to the garage. What happens in the garage at the end of Autoerotic Assimilation is not played for comedy. It is not wrapped in absurdism. It is not given a layer of distance or irony or clever writing to cushion the impact. The show simply shows it to you, directly, quietly, over a piece of music, and trusts you to understand what you are watching. Rick has a small creature in the garage, a little alien animal he has been keeping there. He takes it out. He holds it gently. He pets it. The creature makes sounds. Rick's face while he does this is the face of a man who has run completely out of things to say, even to himself. Then he uses a laser to end the creature's life. He does it carefully, almost tenderly, as though making sure it does not suffer. And then Rick sits down underneath the same laser. He positions himself under it. He reaches for the controls. he passes out. He is drunk enough in that moment that his body simply gives out before he can complete what he sat down to do. He slumps forward over his workbench, unconscious, and the laser fires harmlessly over him. He remains there, face down, passed out for what the show implies is a very long time. Hours at minimum, possibly through the night. The song playing over this sequence is called Do You Feel It by a band called Chaos Chaos. It is a slow, floating, aching piece of music that sounds like the feeling of being awake at 4 in the morning in a quiet house when everything that is wrong with your life is the only thing you can hear. It fits the scene so precisely that it feels less like a song chosen to accompany a moment, and more like a piece of music that was written for this exact version of this exact man in this exact garage. The episode ends. No one comes to check on Rick. No one finds him. No one has an intervention. Morty and Summer do not know what happened. Beth and Jerry do not know what happened. The universe does not pause. Life does not stop. The next episode begins more or less normally. Rick wakes up eventually, presumably with a significant hangover, and the show continues. The decision not to address what happened in the garage directly, not in the episode, not in the ones immediately following it, is one of the most honest, creative choices the show ever made. Because that is what it actually looks like when something like this happens and goes unseen. There is no music sting to tell you how to feel about it afterward. There is no conversation where someone sits Rick down and acknowledges what he almost did. The world does not reorganize itself around the fact that the previous night was as dark as it was. It just keeps going. Because the world keeps going. That is, in its way, one of the show's most direct statements about the indifference it keeps coming back to. The universe did not notice. The family did not know. Even the audience, if they were not paying close attention, might have absorbed it as just another weird moment in a show full of weird moments. But it was not a weird moment. It was a man at the bottom of the bottommost point in his emotional life, alone in a garage with no one coming. There is something specific about what the Unity storyline reveals about Rick that goes beyond the obvious darkness of how it ends. It is what happens during the reunion that matters just as much as what happens after Unity leaves. For the duration of the episode, while Rick is with Unity, he is a different person. Not a better person in every sense. He still does reckless and selfish things, but he is present. He is engaged. He is connected to something outside himself in a way that the Rick of ordinary episodes almost never is. He is, in the most basic human sense, not alone. And what the end of the episode reveals is that the thing Rick has been running from by being constantly in motion, by having the adventures, by drinking, by surrounding himself with chaos and noise and the endless demands of saving and destroying things across the multiverse, is not meaninglessness, it is loneliness. The specific, bone-deep loneliness of someone who has spent decades being the most capable person in every room while being completely unable to let anyone inside the room that actually matters. Rick's nihilism often gets framed as a conclusion he reached through observation. He looked at the universe, understood it, and concluded that nothing had meaning. But the end of autoerotic assimilation complicates that framing significantly, because what Rick does in the garage that night is not the behavior of a man who has genuinely accepted meaninglessness and found peace with it. It is the behavior of a man who is in unbearable pain and has run out of ways to manage it. Those are not the same thing. A person who truly believed nothing mattered would not be destroyed by being left. They would not feel the specific devastation of rejection, the specific ache of a note that says, "You make me worse." You cannot be hurt like that by something that means nothing. Rick is hurt like that, completely. The hurt is total and it is real, and it ends with him alone in a garage under a laser. Which means that Unity mattered. Which means that being left by Unity meant something. Which means that somewhere, underneath all the philosophy and all the performance, Rick Sanchez is a man who can still be broken by love. And a man who can be broken by love is not a man who has truly surrendered to the idea that nothing matters. He is a man who wants things to matter and cannot figure out how to survive the fact that the things that matter most to him keep being taken away. The small creature Rick pets before using the laser on it is worth one more moment of attention. The show does not explain why Rick keeps this creature. It does not give it a name or a backstory. It is just there, in the garage, quietly. And in the most devastating moment of Rick's personal story up to that point in the show, Rick takes the time to be gentle with it, to make its end as painless as possible, to hold it while it goes. This is not the behavior of a nihilist. This is the behavior of someone who, even at their absolute lowest, still has enough care left to extend it to a small creature that most people in his position would not even notice. The nihilism says nothing matters. The hand that carefully holds the small alien says otherwise. The two things exist simultaneously in the same garage, in the same man, in the same few minutes, and both of them are real. That is the honest portrait the show is building. Not a man who has successfully removed himself from feeling. Not a man who has found peace in the void. A man in whom the capacity for feeling and the philosophy that denies it are constantly at war, and neither side ever fully wins. And the result of that ongoing war is a person who is in great pain and has been for a very long time. After this night, the show eventually confirms that Rick begins regularly attending therapy sessions with Dr. Wong. He does not go willingly. He does not go and emerge transformed. But he goes. The man who turned himself into a pickle to avoid one appointment eventually made the appointments a recurring part of his life. Something shifted, however slightly, in the direction of continuing. It is not a resolution. It is barely even a beginning. But it is Rick, in his own slow and reluctant way, choosing to stay. Choosing to keep going. Even after the garage. Even after the note. Even after the song played and the night passed and the universe continued without acknowledging any of it. The choice to stay is the most quiet and most important choice Rick makes in the entire series. And it is a choice he has to keep making across every season against the persistent pull of a worldview that tells him the choice itself is meaningless. But Rick's struggle with meaning is not just a private war fought in his garage at night. It has a public face as well. A face built out of power and architecture and an entire civilization that Rick constructed and then abandoned because it became a mirror, showing him exactly the kind of person his nihilism had been slowly turning him into. Because while Rick was moving through the multiverse, building things and destroying things and drinking and searching and hurting and surviving, he also built something enormous. Something that was supposed to organize the chaos of infinite Ricks into something manageable. Something that was supposed to give the multiverse a shape. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And what he built became one of the clearest possible examples of what happens when a nihilist is given unlimited power and uses it to try to fill a hole that power was never going to fill. Section 7. The Citadel. Rick built a society he despised. At some point during the decades Rick spent hunting Rick Prime across the multiverse, something went wrong in a way that was different from all the other things that had been going wrong. Rick had been killing Ricks. Not all of them, not randomly, but enough. When alternate versions of himself got in the way of his search, or when he suspected one of them might be the Rick responsible for the bomb in his garage, he eliminated them. He was ruthless about it. He had one mission, and anything that interfered with that mission was a problem to be removed. Other Ricks were not innocent bystanders to him. They were obstacles, or suspects, or both. He moved through the multiverse, leaving a trail of dead versions of himself that stretched across more dimensions than most beings would ever visit in a lifetime. Eventually, the surviving Ricks had enough. They organized. They formed a group. They started sending teams after Rick C-137 specifically, coordinating across dimensions to try to bring him down. And for a while, it was a war. Rick against a growing coalition of alternate versions of himself, each one as intelligent as he was, each one aware of how he thought because they thought the same way. Each one motivated by the very reasonable desire to not be the next Rick he killed. Rick survived it. He kept surviving it, the way Rick survives everything, through a combination of intelligence and adaptability, and the specific kind of stubbornness that comes from having nothing left to lose. But surviving an endless war against infinite versions of yourself is not a sustainable situation. Eventually, something had to change. What changed is that Rick C-137 made a deal. He stopped the killing, at least enough to sit down and negotiate. And what came out of the negotiation was something that nobody, probably including Rick himself, fully anticipated when it began. He built them a home. He built the Citadel of Ricks. The Citadel of Ricks is a massive structure, essentially a space station or a small city that exists outside of any single dimension and serves as a central gathering point for alternate versions of Rick and their respective Mortys from across the multiverse. It has a government, it has an economy, it has law enforcement, class divisions, social hierarchies, neighborhoods, jobs, politics, corruption, elections, and every other feature of a functioning civilization. It is enormous and complex, and it runs in its own chaotic way as an actual society. Rick built all of this. The smartest man in the multiverse, the person who says nothing has value and civilization is a trap that small minds build to feel safe, designed and constructed an entire civilization from the ground up. He also did something else, something that goes hand in hand with the Citadel and is in some ways more revealing than the Citadel itself. He engineered what the show calls the central finite curve. This was a kind of invisible boundary around the portion of the multiverse that Ricks could access through their portal guns. And the specific function of this boundary was to filter out any dimension where a Rick Sanchez was not the smartest being in the universe. In practical terms, this meant that every dimension any Rick could travel to using portal technology was a dimension where Rick was, by definition, the most powerful and most intelligent entity in the room. The infinite multiverse, in its full and actual form, contains dimensions where beings exist that would make even Rick ordinary. Dimensions where intelligence far beyond his operates, where he would be unremarkable, where his genius would not set him apart in any meaningful way. The central finite curve made all of those dimensions unreachable. It effectively edited the accessible multiverse down to the portion where Rick always mattered most. Think about the combination of those two things. A man who says nothing matters built a civilization and then rigged the entire accessible multiverse to ensure that he always mattered within it. The philosophy and the behavior are directly contradicting each other. The philosophy says meaning is an illusion. The behavior says Rick spent enormous effort and intelligence making absolutely sure that a very specific kind of meaning, his own relevance, his own superiority, was structurally protected and impossible to accidentally stumble outside of. The Citadel is introduced to the audience in Season 1, Episode 10, an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. At this point in the show, the Citadel appears mainly as a governing body that has authority over Ricks across the multiverse. It is bureaucratic and self-important, and the Ricks who run it are pompous and political in ways that seem completely at odds with how Rick C-137 operates. He clearly hates being there. He is dismissive of the whole structure. He treats the Rick officials with contempt and barely concealed irritation. From the outside, the Citadel looks like exactly the kind of thing Rick would never have had anything to do with. It is not until much later, in Rick Mirai Jack, that the show confirms Rick built the whole thing. That reveal reframes every moment of Rick's contempt for the Citadel that came before it. He was not disgusted by something other people built. He was disgusted by something he built. Every pompous Rick official, every corrupt system, every stupid political maneuver the Citadel engaged in. All of it grew from the seed Rick planted when he designed the place. He made it, handed it over, and then spent years watching it become everything he hated about civilization. Which is to say, everything that civilization reliably becomes when you give intelligent, selfish beings the power to organize themselves. The Citadel became a mirror, and what it reflected back at Rick was the logical endpoint of a nihilist building institutions. If you believe nothing has inherent value, if you do not build with care towards some actual human good, if the structure is built primarily to serve your own need for control and relevance, then what you build will reflect those absences. The Citadel has a class system where lower versions of Rick are treated as second class. It has Mortys who are used as tools and status symbols. It has corruption running through every level of its government. It has the specific cruelty of a society designed by brilliant people who did not care about the people who would have to live inside it. This is confirmed in devastating detail in Season 3, Episode 7, an episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which is also known as Tales from the Citadel. This episode follows several different Ricks and Mortys living ordinary lives inside the Rick citadel, and paints a picture of a society that is deeply, structurally broken. Working-class Ricks who are looked down on by the elite, Mortys who are kept in exploitative conditions, a police force that operates by its own rules, and at the end, a Morty who campaigns for political office on a message of change and hope, and wins. And then, in the final moments, reveals that he has been evil Morty all along, consolidating power inside the very institution he claimed to want to reform. Rick is not present in this episode at all. He does not need to be. The Citadel tells his story without him. It is a portrait of what nihilism looks like when it is given enough power and enough time to build something. It builds systems that replicate the worst of what already exists. It builds hierarchies and cruelties and power structures that serve the people at the top. It builds something that looks from a distance like civilization and feels from the inside like a trap. Rick eventually walked away from the Citadel. He abandoned it. He left the thing he built, with all its corruption and all its cruelty and all its pompous self-importance, and went back to being alone in the multiverse. This is presented in Rick Mirai Jack as a continuation of his downward spiral. After decades of failed searching and the abandonment of the Citadel, Rick hit what the show depicts as close to the absolute bottom of his life. Drinking heavily. No mission, no structure, no purpose. Just a man moving through infinite dimensions with nothing pulling him in any particular direction. And then he crashed into a garage. The garage belonging to a family named Smith, in the dimension that Rick Prime had originally come from and then abandoned. The dimension where Morty was growing up without a grandfather. The decision to settle there was not random. Rick had a reason. He chose that specific dimension because Rick Prime had come from it, and Rick reasoned that if he waited there long enough, Prime would eventually return. It was still, even at that point, a revenge strategy, a long game, a way to organize the waiting around something that looked like purpose. But something happened that Rick probably did not plan on. He got attached. He bonded with Morty. He found himself, slowly and reluctantly, and probably against his better judgment, caring about the family he had moved in with in a way that was real rather than strategic. The mission that brought him to the dimension became, over time, less important than the people he found there. This is the part of Rick's relationship with the Citadel that does not get talked about enough. Because the Citadel is not just a piece of backstory about what Rick did between the bomb in the garage and the beginning of the show. It is evidence of what Rick has always done when faced with the question of what to do next after losing the thing that gave him a reason to keep going. After Diane and Beth died, Rick built a portal gun and a mission. After that mission failed to produce results for long enough, Rick built a civilization. After the civilization became something he could not stand to look at, he abandoned it and eventually found a family. The pattern is consistent. Rick does not sit with emptiness. He builds things to fill it. Sometimes those things are extraordinary. Sometimes they are destructive. Sometimes, as with the Citadel, they are both simultaneously. But the building is always the same impulse. It is the impulse of a man who needs the world to have shape. Who needs, despite everything he says about meaning being an illusion, for there to be something organizing the days, something to move toward, something that makes the next hour different from the last one. A man who truly believed nothing mattered would not build civilizations. He would not rig the multiverse to ensure his relevance. He would not crash deliberately into the specific dimension most likely to eventually bring his enemy back within reach. Rick builds. Rick plans. Rick organizes the universe around purposes that he will deny having as soon as anyone asks him directly. And every time he walks away from something he built, the Citadel, eventually the mission itself, he lands somewhere new and starts building again. Because the alternative, the actual full experience of a universe with no shape and no purpose and no next thing to reach for, is something Rick has touched the edges of. In the garage after Unity, in the decades of failed searching, in the depression that follows every time the current organizing purpose collapses. He knows what the bottom feels like. And every civilization he builds, every mission he runs, every relationship he refuses to name but refuses to let go of, is Rick choosing, in his own way, not to go back there. The Citadel was the grandest version of that choice. An entire civilization built by one man's grief and need and nihilism and stubborn refusal to fully surrender to the emptiness. It became something ugly. It became something Rick despised. But it kept him going for long enough to find Morty. And Morty, as the next section of this story will show, turned out to be the one relationship Rick could not build a wall around, no matter how hard he tried. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Though the specific reason that relationship became so complicated and so meaningful is darker than most people realize. Because the Morty that Rick found in that garage and has been adventuring with ever since is not, canonically, his own grandson. And who Morty actually belongs to changes everything. Section 8. Morty is Rick Prime's grandson, the cruelest joke in the multiverse. Rick Sanchez has done a lot of extraordinary things across the run of the show. He has built civilizations. He has destroyed them. He has outsmarted gods and governments and every law enforcement organization in the known multiverse. He has survived situations that should have killed him hundreds of times over. He has done things that required a level of intelligence so far beyond ordinary human capability that watching him operate sometimes feels less like watching a person and more like watching a force of nature that happens to be wearing a lab coat. But of all the things Rick has done, one of the quietest and most devastating is something he did not do with explosions or portal guns or brilliant plans. He did it by choosing a garage. By choosing a specific dimension out of infinite possible dimensions to crash into when he had nowhere else to go. By making a choice that seemed, on the surface, like strategy, and turned out to be something far more complicated than strategy ever gets to be. Because the dimension Rick chose to settle in, the one where Morty lives, the one where the show takes place, is not a random selection. It is Rick Prime's original dimension. The place Rick Prime came from before he invented portal travel and left. The place where Rick Prime abandoned Abeth and her children and never came back. Rick chose it specifically because he wanted to be there when Prime eventually returned. He wanted to be waiting. That plan made perfect tactical sense. What Rick did not plan for, what the show eventually reveals as one of its most quietly cruel pieces of canonical information, is what it means about Morty. The confirmation comes in Season 6, Episode 1, an episode called Solarix. An event causes everyone who has traveled through portals to be sent back to their original dimension of birth. Rick ends up back in Dimension C-137, the dimension where Diane and Beth died, the dimension he originally came from and has not lived in since the bomb. Morty ends up somewhere else entirely. And when Rick goes to retrieve him, the show makes explicit something that had been building in the background of the story for a long time. The Morty that Rick has been traveling with is not biologically his grandson. He is Rick Prime's grandson. Let that land for a moment. The boy Rick has been protecting across 6 seasons of the show, the boy Rick has built genuine attachment to, the boy whose worst memories Rick secretly deleted to protect him from suffering, the boy who Rick has consistently chosen to keep by his side when he could have replaced him at any point at the Citadel. That boy is the biological grandson of the man who sent a bomb through a portal and killed Diane and Beth. Morty's original Rick, the Rick who would have been his actual grandfather in the conventional sense, was Rick Prime, the same Rick who abandoned this family before the events of the show. The same Rick who, it is eventually revealed, used a weapon called the Omega device to erase Diane from every single dimension in existence. The same Rick who spent decades being the primary target of Rick C-137's rage and grief and purpose. And Rick C-137 knew this. Not from the beginning, but he knew it before most of the show's audience did. He chose to keep Morty anyway. He kept adventuring with him. He kept protecting him. He kept quietly caring about him in all the ways Rick cares about things, which is to say, indirectly, and while pretending not to. For years of in-show time. The original reason Rick came to this dimension was, as established, to wait for Rick Prime to return. He chose the dimension Prime abandoned specifically because he believed Prime might eventually come back to it. It was a trap dressed up as a home. A revenge strategy dressed up as a family situation. But something the show is careful to establish is that whatever the original intention was, it did not stay only strategic. Rick bonded with Morty, not because it served a purpose, not because Morty's brainwaves were useful for hiding Rick's own intelligence signature from enemies, which is the explanation Rick gives out loud whenever the subject comes up. That explanation is technically true in the show's logic, but it is also clearly not the whole truth, and the show makes this clear repeatedly across every season. Rick keeps the same Morty. This is worth understanding in context. The Citadel is full of alternate Mortys from across the multiverse. If Rick's relationship with Morty were purely practical, purely about the brainwave masking utility, there would be no reason to maintain attachment to one specific Morty. Any Morty would serve the same functional purpose. Rick has access to infinite Mortys. He keeps this one. He keeps him through dimension-destroying events and personality changes and moments where keeping him creates enormous complications. He keeps him even after finding out who Morty's original Rick was. That choice, the ongoing, repeated choice to keep this specific Morty, is the clearest possible evidence that the relationship is real. That it grew past whatever it started as. That Rick, somewhere along the way, stopped treating Morty as a strategic asset and started treating him as something he was not willing to lose. Now consider what it means that this Morty, specifically, is the grandson of the man who destroyed Rick's life. The cruelty of it is almost architectural. Rick lost Diane and Beth because of Rick Prime. He spent decades hunting Rick Prime. He organized his entire existence around the goal of finding Rick Prime and making him pay. And in the middle of all of that, in the dimension he chose specifically because of its connection to Prime, he found a 14-year-old boy and fell in love with him, the way grandparents fall in love with grandchildren. Gradually and completely, and without quite meaning to. And that boy carries Rick Prime's blood. The show does not make this into a dramatic confrontation. Rick does not have a scene where he processes this revelation out loud and concludes something definitive about what it means. The show simply puts the information on the table and lets it sit there, the way it lets most of its most important information sit, without editorializing, without telling you how to feel about it. Just, here is the thing that is true, now live with it. What the audience can do, that Rick rarely does, is look at the situation from the outside and see what it actually says about him. Rick, a man who defines himself by intelligence and control and the ability to see the whole board, found himself genuinely attached to a child who is biologically connected to his worst enemy. Rick, who built the central finite curve to maintain his relevance and control across the multiverse, could not control the fact that the relationship he formed in the dimension he chose for strategic reasons turned into the most meaningful relationship in his current life. Rick, who says nothing matters, found that this specific boy matters to him enough that even knowing who Morty's original grandfather is, he does not walk away. That is not the behavior of nihilism. That is the behavior of love making a complete mess of nihilism, of attachment forming in the exact place where, if Rick were really living by his stated philosophy, it should have been easiest to remain detached. There is a moment in Rick Mirai Jack that speaks to this without spelling it out. When the full truth of Rick's backstory is being shown, including the connection between this dimension and Rick Prime, the show makes clear that Rick understood what he was getting into when he settled here. He came knowing this family belonged, in some cosmic sense, to the Rick he was hunting. He came knowing that the Beth here was not his Beth, that the Morty here was not his Morty in any biological sense. And he stayed. He kept staying. Through the events of the show, through everything that happened across the seasons, he kept staying in a dimension that was never really his, with a family that was never really his, built around a grandson who carries the genetic line of the man who took everything from him. The reading the show invites is not that this is sick or strange. It is that it is desperately human. Rick lost his family. He found a version of his family. The version he found is entangled with the loss in the most painful way imaginable, and he chose it anyway. Because the alternative was not having a family at all. And Rick, for all his speeches about how family is a biological accident and love is just chemicals and relationships are traps that weak people fall into, Rick without a family is the version of Rick who sits in a garage under a laser. Rick has always known this about himself, even when he refused to say it out loud. Morty, being Rick Prime's grandson, does not cancel what Morty is to Rick. It complicates it, endlessly and painfully, but it does not cancel it. If anything, the complication makes the choice to stay more significant rather than less. Rick is not attached to Morty despite knowing what he knows. He is attached to Morty while knowing what he knows. The knowledge is part of the relationship. He carries it with him on every adventure, in every moment of genuine warmth between them, in every quiet choice to protect this specific boy when protecting any other Morty would have served the same practical purpose. The universe, in Rick and Morty, has a tendency to set up situations that make a mockery of the idea that things can be clean, that grief can be processed and put away, that revenge can be pursued without becoming the thing you are pursuing. That meaning can be found without attaching itself to exactly the most complicated possible source. Rick wanted justice for what happened to his family. The closest thing he has to family now is the grandson of the man who took his original family away. He wanted a purpose that had nothing to do with the ordinary emotional vulnerabilities of human connection. The thing that keeps him going is his relationship with a 14-year-old boy who has no idea, for most of the show, how much weight he is actually carrying in Rick's internal life. This is the multiverse being specifically, precisely cruel in the way that only the multiverse, with its infinite capacity for ironic arrangement, can be cruel. Rick built a life out of the wreckage of his old life, and the foundation of that new life is structurally connected to the thing that destroyed the old one. There is no clean separation. There is no version of caring about Morty that does not also mean living with what Morty represents about where Rick ended up and how he got there. And Rick lives with it every day without ever fully saying so out loud. In the way he keeps Morty close, in the way he clears the worst memories from Morty's mind to protect him from unnecessary suffering, in the way he chooses, again and again, to keep this specific boy safe in a universe that is demonstrably not safe for anyone. The nihilism says none of this should matter. The man keeps showing up anyway. What the connection between Morty and Rick Prime ultimately reveals is that Rick's nihilism has never been able to survive actual contact with the people he loves. He can perform it brilliantly in the abstract. He can argue it with complete conviction when the subject is theoretical. But put a specific person in front of him, a Unity, a Morty, a Beth, and the philosophy starts to crack at exactly the places where it matters most. The next section is where that cracking becomes most visible. Because as devastating as the revelation about Morty's origins is, it is actually the story of what Rick does with Morty that most clearly dismantles the nihilism from the inside. Specifically, what Rick does in secret. The things he does for Morty when nobody is watching, when there is no audience, when the performance is completely unnecessary. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because it turns out that when Rick thinks nobody is paying attention, he is a completely different kind of person than the one he shows the world. And the evidence of that has been quietly accumulating in Morty's mind for years. Section 9. Existence is pain. How Rick uses Morty as his reason to stay. Rick Sanchez has a rule about caring. The rule is that he does not do it. Or more precisely, the rule is that he does not admit to doing it. He has constructed his entire public personality around the idea that attachment is weakness, that emotional investment in other people is just biology tricking you into behaving in ways that benefit the species, that the version of himself who is most honest about the universe is the version who needs nobody and feels nothing and keeps moving through infinite dimensions with the same casual indifference that most people reserve for changing television channels. This is the Rick that most of the people around him see most of the time. This is the Rick that gives speeches about meaninglessness. The Rick that treats entire civilizations as inconveniences. The Rick that responds to genuine emotional moments with a burp and a subject change. The performance is so consistent and so polished that it is easy to accept it as the full picture. But the show keeps showing you what Rick does when he thinks nobody is watching. And what Rick does when he thinks nobody is watching is one of the most important things in the entire series. Season 3, Episode 6 is called Rest and Ricklaxation. The basic setup involves Rick and Morty visiting an alien spa where a machine removes what it identifies as each person's toxic qualities, the parts of themselves that cause harm to themselves and others. The machine separates these toxic elements out into physical form, creating separate versions of Rick and Morty made entirely of the qualities being removed. When the process is finished, what is left of Rick is a version of himself without the qualities the machine classified as harmful. This version of Rick is calmer, more pleasant, more functional in ordinary social situations. He is capable of connecting with people without immediately undermining the connection. He is, by most external measures, a healthier and more stable person. And this version of Rick identifies his love for Morty as one of the toxins that was removed, not as a strength, not as one of the things that keeps him going or gives his life shape. The clean, non-toxic version of Rick looks at the attachment he has to Morty and classifies it as something harmful, something that holds him back, a vulnerability that the healthier version of himself is better off without. This is a deeply uncomfortable piece of information, and the show knows it. It is presented without comment. The implication is simply put on the table. The part of Rick that loves Morty is also the part of Rick that causes him suffering. The attachment and the pain are not separate things. They grew from the same place, and they cannot be cleanly divided. But here is where the episode turns into something genuinely important rather than just dark. At the end of the story, Rick has a choice. He can stay as the cleaner, more stable, less vulnerable version of himself. Or he can re-merge with everything that was removed, including the love for Morty that the machine classified as a toxic. Rick chooses to re-merge. He takes the toxic version of himself back in. All of it, including the part that loves Morty in a way that causes him pain. He does not explain this choice at length. He does not make a speech about it. He just does it. He makes the choice to be the version of himself that is capable of being hurt by caring about someone. Because the alternative, the cleaner, less suffering version, is not actually him. The capacity for attachment, even when the machine correctly identifies it as a source of pain, is not something Rick is willing to amputate. Not even when given the explicit option to do so. This is one of the most honest moments the show ever gives Rick. Not because he says something true out loud, but because he makes a choice that reveals something true. He would rather be the broken, caring version than the functional, detached one. Season 3, Episode 8 is called Morty's Mind Blowers. On the surface, it is structured as a clips episode, a collection of short stories from adventures that did not make it into the regular run of episodes. But underneath that format is something much more significant. The episode reveals that Rick has a secret collection of Morty's memories. Not just any memories, specific ones. The worst ones. The most traumatic, most painful, most damaging experiences from their adventures together that Morty either does not remember correctly, remembers in a distorted way, or does not remember at all. And the reason Morty does not remember them correctly is that Rick removed them. Rick has been quietly, systematically going into Morty's mind and taking out the memories that would cause him the most lasting damage. He has been doing this without Morty's knowledge, without asking permission, without any acknowledgement or credit or even the possibility of gratitude, because Morty cannot thank Rick for something Morty does not know happened. Think about what this reveals. Rick, who tells Morty constantly that the universe does not care about them and that suffering is just part of existing in a meaningless cosmos, has been spending significant effort and care making sure that Morty's experience of that universe is slightly less painful than it would otherwise be. He has been acting in secret, in direct contradiction to everything he says out loud about how things work and what they are worth. The effort involved in what Rick has been doing is not trivial. He does not just wave his hand and erase a bad memory. He goes in carefully, extracts the specific memory, stores it, and does all of this without leaving traces that would alert Morty to what happened. This is not a casual thing Rick does on a lazy afternoon. It is deliberate and careful and private. It is Rick, when no one is watching, choosing to protect someone he claims not to be protecting. There is also Season 2, Episode 1, called A Rickle in Time. Early in this episode, Rick and Morty find themselves in a situation where the timeline around them becomes unstable. The instability puts both of them in danger. At one point, Rick is faced with a choice that puts his own survival at odds with Morty's. He moves toward sacrificing himself to save Morty. He begins the action of giving up his own life. Then, he finds a way to save both of them. He does not end up dying. But the initial movement towards self-sacrifice, the instinct that fired before the clever solution presented itself, was real. Rick's first response to Morty being in mortal danger was to put himself between Morty and the danger, without calculating whether it was worth it first. For a man who says nothing and no one has inherent value, that instinct reveals a lot. These moments, the emerging with the toxins, the secret memory deletions, the instinct towards self-sacrifice, are not isolated incidents. They form a pattern. A consistent, recurring pattern of Rick behaving, when the performance is not required, as someone who cares deeply about a specific person and quietly organizes his behavior around protecting that person from unnecessary harm. This is the real answer to why Rick keeps going. Not the revenge quest, which ended and left him empty. Not the citadel, which he built and abandoned. Not the alcohol, which numbs but does not fill anything. What has kept Rick alive and functioning and present across the run of the show, in the most practical sense, is Morty. Not as a concept, not as a strategy, as a specific boy whose worst memories Rick keeps in jars so that Morty does not have to carry them. The nihilism gives Rick a reason to dismiss everything. Morty gives Rick a reason that the nihilism cannot quite reach. Every time the philosophy says nothing is worth staying for, the habit of staying for Morty overrides it. Not loudly, not with speeches, just quietly, in the form of continued presence, of showing up, of getting in the ship one more time. The most painful version of this dynamic is visible in the Season 5 finale, when the full truth about Morty's connection to Rick Prime is confirmed. Rick knows by this point that the boy he has been protecting is biologically the grandson of the man who killed Diane and Beth. He knows the connection. He carries it. And he keeps choosing Morty anyway. He keeps clearing the memories. He keeps getting in the ship. He keeps being present in the particular, reluctant, grudging, unmistakable way that is Rick's version of love. Morty, for most of the show, has no idea how much of his grandfather's interior life he is quietly holding in place. He knows Rick cares in the way you know things about people you have spent enormous amounts of time with, but he does not know about the jars. He does not know that the worst things he cannot quite remember are sitting on a shelf in the garage, carefully preserved, removed by someone who decided Morty should not have to carry them. He does not know that every morning Rick chooses to keep going is a morning Rick chose him. But if Rick's relationship with Morty is the thing that keeps him present, there is still the question of what happens when Morty absorbs the philosophy Rick has been building around himself for decades. Because the nihilism does not just stay in Rick. It travels. It moves through proximity and through the sheer amount of time Morty spends at Rick's side, in Rick's universe, living by Rick's rules. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And eventually, there is a moment where Morty does not just hear the nihilism, he says it, clearly and directly, and to someone who needs a different answer, in one of the most quoted and most quietly devastating speeches the show has ever written. Section 10. Nobody exists on purpose. When Morty absorbs the philosophy. There is a moment in Season 1 where Morty Smith sits down next to his sister in a bedroom and says something that has no business coming out of a 14-year-old's mouth. Not because it is violent or cruel or inappropriate in the way that things are usually considered inappropriate for someone that age, but because it is too settled, too calm, too completely at peace with ideas that most adults spend their entire lives running away from. The words come out of Morty quietly and without drama. The way you say something you have thought about for a long time and have finally finished arguing with yourself about. The episode is called Ricksty Minutes. It is Season 1, Episode 8. And the speech Morty gives in that bedroom is, in many ways, the moment the show's philosophy stops belonging only to Rick and starts belonging to the story as a whole. To understand why Morty says what he says, you need to know what happened 2 episodes before it, in Rick Potion number 9. That is the episode where Rick and Morty accidentally destroy their version of Earth. The love potion goes wrong, the corrections make everything worse, and eventually every human being on the planet, outside of the Smith family, is turned into a monstrous creature. There is no fixing it. Rick locates a parallel dimension where an alternate version of himself already solved the problem, confirms that the alternate Rick and Morty died shortly after solving it, and lands the ship next to their bodies. Morty digs a grave in the backyard of the house. He buries himself. He buries a version of himself that was alive that morning, that had a life and friends and a future, and he puts it in the ground and walks into the house and sits down on the couch while Rick turns on the television like nothing happened. The show does not give Morty a breakdown in that moment. It gives him a face. A specific, particular expression that is not quite shock and not quite grief, but is something in between. The expression of a person who has just understood something that cannot be ununderstood. Something that changes the shape of every ordinary moment that comes after it. Morty now lives on top of his own grave, in a house that belongs to a family that is almost, but not exactly his. In a dimension that he moved into by stepping over the body of the version of himself who used to live there. He goes to school the next day. He eats breakfast. He does everything that daily life requires of him, and underneath all of it is the knowledge of what is buried in the backyard. In Rick's Minutes, the Smith family gets into a fight. Beth and Jerry are watching alternate versions of their lives through Rick's cable box, seeing the paths their lives could have taken if they had made different choices. What they see shakes them both. Summer, caught in the middle of her parents' conflict, goes upstairs and starts packing a bag. She has decided to run away. She tells Morty that she has been thinking about whether she even belongs in this family, whether her existence makes sense, whether any of this has a point. And Morty sits down next to her on the bed and tells her the truth. His truth. The truth he has been sitting with since the night he dug the grave. He tells her that he is not from this dimension, that the Rick and Morty who originally lived in this house are buried in the backyard. That he and Rick came from a different version of reality and took their place. He shows her the window so she can see the grave from where they are sitting. And then he says the thing that the show has been building toward since the moment Rick first opened a portal and showed Morty how big the universe actually is. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV. That speech is 4 sentences. It is arguably the most complete and honest summary of the show's philosophical position that any character ever delivers. And it comes not from Rick, the genius who has spent decades arriving at his worldview through experience and loss and the accumulated evidence of infinite dimensions. It comes from a 14-year-old boy sitting on a bed next to his sister, speaking from a place of genuine and recently acquired understanding. The first 3 sentences are the nihilism. Pure and direct. Nobody exists on purpose. There was no intention behind your arrival here, no design, no cosmic reason that you specifically came into being. Nobody belongs anywhere. The idea of a place that is yours, a home that was meant for you, a position in the world that fits the shape of who you are, is a comfort story rather than a fact. Everybody's gonna die. The endpoint is the same for every version of every person in every dimension, and no amount of meaning-making changes that outcome. These are Rick's conclusions, the ones he has reached through decades of experience with the infinite, through the loss of Diane and Beth, through years of watching the multiverse confirm over and over that the universe does not organize itself around human hopes or human pain. Morty has arrived at the same conclusions in a fraction of the time, through the specific and brutal education of living with Rick and experiencing firsthand what it means when the things you thought were permanent turn out not to be. But the 4th sentence is where something shifts. Something that separates what Morty is doing in that moment from pure despair. Come watch TV. This is not dismissal. It is not Morty giving up or telling Summer that her pain does not matter or that she should stop feeling what she is feeling. It is something much more specific and much harder to arrive at. It is an invitation. It is Morty saying, I know all of these things are true. I live on top of the proof that they are true, and I am still here. I am still in this house. I am still watching television with the people around me, and you can be too. The Camus comparison is worth making plainly. Albert Camus was a philosopher who wrote about the absurd, the gap between human beings desperately wanting life to have meaning and the universe offering no confirmation that it does. His conclusion was not that this gap should lead to despair or to giving up. His conclusion was that a person could look directly at the meaninglessness, understand it completely, and choose to engage with life anyway. He wrote that you have to imagine a figure from Greek mythology named Sisyphus, a man condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to have it roll back down every time, as happy. Not because the situation is good, but because the choosing to continue is itself the answer to the meaninglessness. Morty's Come Watch TV is that conclusion stripped of all its academic language and delivered in the plainest terms possible by a 14-year-old who has been living it rather than theorizing about it. The universe is the way it is. The grave is in the backyard, none of that changes. But there is a television on downstairs and people to sit next to while you watch it, and that is available right now. And right now is what there is. Summer does not run away. She goes downstairs. The speech works. Not because it resolves anything or answers the deep questions she was asking, but because it reframes them. Because Morty's version of the nihilism, unlike Rick's performed version, comes with something attached to it. An outstretched hand. A next step. A reason to stay that is not grand or philosophical, but is simply present and specific and immediate. What the episode reveals about how Rick's worldview travels is important. Morty did not arrive at this speech by reading philosophy. He arrived at it by spending time with Rick, by going on the adventures, by seeing what the multiverse actually looks like from the inside rather than the outside, by digging that grave. Rick gave Morty access to the truth of the universe before Morty had any of the protective structures that most people build up over a lifetime to keep that truth at a comfortable distance. Rick showed him how big everything was before he was old enough to have learned how to feel small without being destroyed by it. And Morty, being Morty, processed it in the way he processes most things, by going quiet with it for a while and then coming out the other side with something that is both honest and livable. The difference between Rick's nihilism and Morty's version of it in that moment is the fourth sentence. Rick's nihilism, at its worst, ends at the third sentence. It lands at everybody's gonna die and stays there, in the garage, under the laser, alone. Morty's version keeps going. Come watch TV. Stay. Be here. With me. The meaninglessness is real, and the company is also real, and the company is what we have, so let's be in it together. Rick taught Morty the philosophy. Morty, without realizing it, quietly showed Rick the part of the philosophy Rick had been leaving out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But learning to live with nihilism and learning to build a life inside it are two different challenges. And Rick's version of that challenge reaches its most extreme and most visible point not in a quiet bedroom conversation, but in the most violent episode of the entire series. The episode where Rick finally gets everything he spent decades working toward, the moment the revenge quest ends. And what Rick discovers, standing covered in blood in a room where his worst enemy just died, about what nihilism actually costs a person when the one thing holding it together is suddenly gone. Section 11. Unmortricken. What happens when the nihilist gets what he wanted? For most of the show's run, Rick Sanchez has had a destination. Not always a visible one, not always one he talked about or acknowledged or let anyone see clearly. But underneath everything, the adventures, the drinking, the speeches about meaninglessness, the citadel, the garage, the family dinners he sat through while looking like he would rather be anywhere else, there was always a direction, a fixed point somewhere out in the multiverse that everything else was quietly organized around. A name, a face, a specific version of himself who sent a bomb through a portal and took away the people Rick loved most. Rick Prime. Finding him and ending him was the engine underneath Rick's entire adult life. Even when Rick stopped actively hunting, even when he settled into the Smith family's dimension and started taking Morty on adventures, and built something that looked, from a distance, like an ordinary grandfather and grandson situation, the mission was still there, running in the background. The reason Rick learned to build a portal gun, The reason he chose this specific dimension. The reason, on some level, for almost every significant decision Rick made from the day the bomb went off until the events of Season 7, Episode 5. That episode is called Unmortricken, and it is where Rick finally gets what he has been working toward for decades. And it is one of the saddest episodes the show has ever made. The episode arrives in the middle of Season 7, not at the end of it. This is a deliberate creative choice by the show's writers, and it matters. On most television shows, the resolution of the central conflict that has been building across the entire series would be saved for a finale. It would be the last thing, the destination at the end of the longest road. Everything building to that one moment, and then the credits rolling, with the weight of the ending still in the air. Unmortricken drops that resolution in the middle of a regular season, surrounded by ordinary episodes. The showrunner confirmed this was intentional. He said that on most shows, this episode would have been a series finale, and he liked that instead it was just an episode in the middle of a season, because that placement tells you something. It tells you that what happens when Rick gets his revenge is not an ending, it is just a moment. A moment that passes, the way all moments pass, and then the world keeps going around it. The setup involves Rick and Morty tracking down Rick Prime using technology Rick salvaged from Prime's hideout. They manage to corner a version of Rick Prime, but it turns out to be a trap. They are pulled into a prison dimension that Rick Prime designed specifically to hold any Rick who got close enough to find him. Inside the prison, Rick Prime forces a group of alternate Ricks into fighting each other with a false promise that the winner will have his Diane returned to him. Rick knows immediately that this is a lie. He kills the last alternate Rick alongside evil Morty, who has been present through the episode and whose own agenda runs parallel to Rick's without fully aligning with it. Eventually, with evil Morty's help, Rick Prime is cornered. He is restrained. Evil Morty does the technical work of disabling Prime's defenses and finding the information he needs for his own purposes. Then he drags Rick into the room and revives him. He steps back. And he gives Rick what Rick has been waiting decades for, the chance to end it. What follows is not triumphant. It is not the release of a long-held breath or the satisfying click of something finally falling into place. It is brutal and slow and ugly. Rick beats Rick Prime to death. Not with a weapon or a clever device or the kind of clean, decisive ending that revenge fantasies usually promise. With his hands. Slowly. While Rick Prime, defiant and contemptuous to his last breath, mocks Rick for becoming exactly like him. Tells him that everything he did in the name of vengeance made him the same as the man he hated. That the decades of hunting and killing and building and destroying were not justice. They were just Rick Prime's influence spreading through the multiverse in a different shape. Rick Prime dies still laughing. Still sneering, refusing to give Rick the one thing that would have made the moment feel like something other than another loss. An acknowledgement that it mattered, that Rick's grief was real and his anger was justified, and the decades of pain meant something. Rick Prime never gives him that. He takes it to whatever passes for a grave in a universe where alternate versions of yourself exist in infinite supply. When Rick comes out of the room, he is covered in blood. He looks at evil Morty. Evil Morty looks back at him and says, simply and without cruelty, that Rick does not look satisfied. He is not telling Rick anything Rick does not already know. He is just naming what is visible on Rick's face. What is visible is emptiness. Complete and total emptiness in the place where decades of purpose used to live. Evil Morty, before leaving, tells Rick that the reason he is not using the weapon he now has access to is that using it would only bring him the same problems it brought Rick Prime. Vengeful people coming after him. He says he just wants to be left alone. And then he looks at Rick and says there is something slightly different about him compared to other Ricks he has encountered. He cannot quite place it. He leaves the possibility open that it might matter someday. Then he leaves. And Rick and Morty go home. The song that plays as Rick tries to come back to ordinary life after all of this is called Look On Down From the Bridge by a band called Mazzy Star. It is slow and aching and sounds like standing very still in the middle of something ending. The show used this same song before in Season 1, Episode 6, when Rick and Morty stood in the backyard of their new dimension and buried their own bodies. It played over two people processing the specific loss of a life they used to have, and learning to exist inside a new one that is similar enough to be livable and different enough to always feel slightly wrong. Using it again here is not accidental. The show is drawing a direct line between those two moments. Between Morty standing over his own grave in Season 1 and Rick standing in his own blood in Season 7, having just ended the thing that organized his life for longer than Morty has been alive. Both moments are about the same experience. The experience of the old life being definitively over and the new one not having fully arrived yet. The strange, weightless feeling of being in between. Of having let go of the thing you were holding and not yet finding the next thing to hold. The family, meanwhile, returns to normal life. Summer, Beth, Jerry. Morty celebrates briefly. The domestic world reasserts itself around Rick the way it always does, cheerfully indifferent to whatever internal earthquake just shifted everything inside him. Rick sits in the middle of it and watches. His face through the episode's final sequence keeps changing when people look away from him. When someone is looking at him directly, he manages something close to ordinary. When no one is looking, the emptiness is right there on the surface. The episode's final scene plays after the main credits. It follows someone else entirely. Slow Mobius was a being connected to Rick, who was killed by Rick Prime during the events of the episode. His wife, after his death, finds herself consumed by the need for revenge. She begins a journey that mirrors Rick's almost exactly. She visits the same kinds of places. She carries the same kind of grief. She has the same destination fixed in her mind. The music that plays under her early journey is the same melancholy music used over Rick's backstory flashback in Rick Mirai Jack. Then, something different happens. She meets someone else who also lost their partner. Someone in the same situation, at the same bottom, looking for the same kind of purpose through revenge. And instead of continuing the hunt, they stop. They stay. They raise their children together. The background music changes as they do. It becomes warmer, more hopeful. The ending they find is the ending Rick was never able to find because he could not stop moving long enough to let it happen. This is the show being as direct as it ever gets about what Rick's choices cost him. It built an alternate version of Rick's story, compressed into a few minutes, and played it out to a different conclusion. It showed what the road not taken looks like. Not idealized, not perfect, just livable, just human. Just the specific, ordinary warmth of two people who chose to stop chasing the past and start inhabiting the present. Rick does not see this scene. He is not in it. He is home. He is empty. He is somewhere at the beginning of figuring out who Rick Sanchez is when Rick Sanchez is not hunting anyone. Dan Harmon, one of the show's creators, spoke about what this episode means for Rick's place in the story going forward. He said that after Unmortricken, Rick is now in the same position that Morty was in at the beginning of the show. Existentially isolated. Not sure where he fits. Looking at the universe around him without a clear sense of what his place in it is supposed to be. He said the shoe is now on the other foot. The man who spent 6 seasons being the one who knew everything and felt nothing is now the one who knows nothing about what comes next and feels everything about the fact that the thing he organized his whole life around is simply gone. The nihilism, which always served partly as a coping strategy for having a purpose that required constant motion, now has nothing to cover. The revenge is done. The mission ended in a room covered in someone else's blood and the sound of his enemy laughing at him. The philosophy that said, nothing matters now, has to survive contact with the specific, concrete experience of getting what you wanted, and finding the wanting was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Rick falls back into depression after this. The show confirms it. He spirals. He loses his sense of direction. The same patterns that defined his worst years, after Diane and Beth, after the Citadel, after Unity, after every other time the current organizing purpose collapsed, those patterns come back. And then Morty helps him find a new one. Not a revenge quest, not a civilization to build, not a mission or a target or a destination, just the adventures themselves. just getting in the ship and going somewhere together. Just the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable thing that two people have when they keep showing up for each other in the absence of any grander reason to do so. It is the smallest possible version of a reason to keep going. It is also, for Rick, enough. The revenge that Rick spent decades pursuing did not give him peace. It gave him proof of something the show has been building toward since the very first episode, that the nihilism was never actually about the universe being meaningless. It was about Rick being unable to find a meaning that could survive the loss of the one he started with. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the final section of this video is about exactly that contradiction. About what it means that a man who has spent the entire show telling everyone around him that nothing matters has quietly, consistently, undeniably been behaving like someone who believes that some things matter more than anything else. About the gap between what Rick says and what Rick does. And about what that gap reveals, when you look at it clearly, about who Rick Sanchez actually is underneath everything he has spent his adult life building on top of the wound. Section 12. The contradiction at the core. Why Rick's nihilism was always a lie he told himself. Rick Sanchez has been lying for most of the show. Not about facts, not about science or the multiverse or the mechanics of how the portal gun works, about himself. About what he believes and what he feels and what actually drives him from one day to the next. He has been delivering the same lie consistently, confidently, with complete conviction across every season of the show to every person he has ever met, and most importantly, to himself. The lie is this, that nothing matters to him. It is the foundation of everything he performs publicly. The drinking is justified by it. The recklessness is explained by it. The refusal to engage with therapy, with family, with genuine emotional vulnerability, all of it rests on the claim that caring is pointless because the universe does not care back. And Rick is too intelligent and too honest to pretend otherwise. He has seen too much. He knows too much. He understands the universe at a level that makes the ordinary human need for meaning look like a child insisting that their imaginary friend is real. This is what Rick says. This is what Rick performs. And the show, from the very beginning, has been quietly and persistently dismantling it, one scene at a time. The most direct dismantling happens in Pickle Rick. Not in the action sequences, not in the brilliant improvised escape from the sewer, but in the 7 or 8 minutes Rick spends in Dr. Wong's office at the end of the episode. Doctor. Wong does not try to outsmart Rick. She does not attempt to win an argument with him about whether nihilism is philosophically correct. She does something much simpler and much more effective. She describes what she sees. She tells Rick that the reason he turns himself into a pickle, the reason he goes to extraordinary lengths to avoid sitting still for any period of time, is not because he has found peace with the meaninglessness of existence. It is because sitting still would require him to feel the things he has been outrunning for decades. She tells him that his intelligence is not being used to understand the world. It is being used to avoid it. Every brilliant escape, every incredible solution to an impossible problem, every moment of genius applied to surviving a situation he created by running from something simpler, all of it is avoidance dressed up as capability. He is not free because he does not care. He is exhausted because he cares enormously and has spent most of his adult life making sure that caring never has to be fully felt. Rick listens to this. He tells her she is very good at her job. He acknowledges that everything she is saying is accurate. He gets up and leaves. The acknowledgement is important. Rick does not argue with Dr. Wong's assessment. He does not produce a counter-argument or dismiss her the way he dismisses most people who try to reach him. He simply agrees, completely, and then demonstrates her entire point by immediately returning to his avoidance rather than doing anything about what she correctly identified. The nihilism is the tool he uses to justify not engaging with what he just admitted is true. He knows the wound is there. He knows the behavior is covering it. He knows all of this with perfect clarity and still chooses the pickle over the conversation. A man who genuinely believed nothing mattered would not need to try this hard to avoid feeling things. Avoidance requires effort. Avoidance is the behavior of someone who is protecting something. You cannot protect something you believe has no value. Then there is Fear No Mort, Season 7, Episode 10. In this episode, Rick and Morty encounter something called the Fear Hole. The Fear Hole is exactly what it sounds like, a place that forces whoever enters it to experience their deepest fear. Not a general anxiety, not a vague unease about death or the unknown, the specific, personal, most fundamental thing that the person experiencing it is most afraid of losing or facing. Rick goes in. What Rick's deepest fear produces is not the death of his intelligence. Not a universe where he is ordinary, or where his genius is taken away. Not the absence of meaning in some grand philosophical sense. What Rick's fear produces is a simulation built around the people he loves, around losing them, again. The fear at the absolute bottom of Rick Sanchez, the thing the fear hole identifies as the thing he protects most fiercely and dreads most completely, is not the cold universe he describes in his speeches. It is the warm, specific, irreplaceable people he keeps insisting he does not need. This is the show being as direct as it ever gets. It reaches past every layer of performance and philosophy and deliberate misdirection and shows you what is actually there. Not nihilism, not comfortable emptiness, terror. The specific terror of someone who loves people and has already lost people and knows from firsthand experience exactly how permanent that loss is and how completely it can remake a person from the inside out. A man who truly believed nothing mattered would not be afraid of losing anything. The fear hole cannot produce fears about things that have no value to the person experiencing it. It goes where the value actually lives. And where it goes, in Rick's case, is directly to the people the nihilism was always pretending not to care about. Look at rest and Ricklaxation again from this angle. The machine that separates Rick's toxic qualities identifies his love for Morty as a toxin. This is worth sitting with for a moment because of what it reveals about Rick's internal relationship with his own capacity for caring. Rick experiences his attachment to Morty as something that damages him, not as a comfort or a strength or a source of meaning, as a vulnerability, as a wound that keeps reopening. The caring hurts Rick because caring requires having something to lose, and Rick's entire history is a long record of losing the things that mattered most to him. From Rick's perspective, inside his own psychology, love and loss are so thoroughly fused together that the machine correctly identifies the love as toxic, because for Rick, the love has always come with the grief already attached to it. You cannot separate them. The capacity for one is the capacity for both, and Rick chooses to reabsorb it anyway. He takes the toxin back. He chooses to remain the version of himself that can be hurt by losing people, rather than the version that has been cleaned of the capacity for that pain. He makes this choice without a speech, without explaining himself. He just does it because the alternative, being the version of Rick who does not love Morty, is a version of Rick that Rick will not become, even when given the explicit option. This is not nothing. This is the most fundamental choice a person can make about who they want to be. And Rick makes it in the direction of the caring, every time when the moment actually arrives. There is also Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort, Season 5, Episode 8. In this episode, it is confirmed that Rick had genuine romantic feelings for Bird Person, that he confessed those feelings to Bird Person at some point before the events of the show, hoping they would travel the multiverse together. Bird Person did not feel the same way. Rick was rejected. This is another piece of the same picture. Rick, the man who says love is just chemicals and connection is just biology, and nothing in the emotional landscape of human experience has any real foundation, Rick confessed romantic feelings to his best friend and was turned down. He was vulnerable enough at some point in his life to do that, to say the thing and risk the answer. And when the answer was not what he hoped, he did not conclude that he had made the correct choice in reaching out. He concluded, another time, that the universe does not organize itself around what Rick Sanchez wants or needs or feels. Every piece of evidence the nihilism is built on is personal. Every single argument Rick makes for the indifference of the universe is sourced in a specific loss. Diane and Beth, the universe does not protect the people you choose over power. Unity. The universe does not give you the love that makes you better rather than worse. Bird person. The universe does not return the feelings you put into it. The revenge. The universe does not feel like what you imagined it would feel like when it is finally over. This is not a philosophy derived from observation. This is grief that found a philosophical form. This is pain that organized itself into a worldview, because a worldview is easier to carry than pain. And then there is the most quietly important piece of all. After Rick Prime is dead, after the revenge is done, and the emptiness arrives, and the depression comes back, and Rick loses his sense of direction for the second time in the same adult life, what pulls him out of it is not a new mission, not a new civilization to build, not another target to hunt. It is Morty. Specifically, Morty helping Rick find a reason to keep doing the adventures. Not for any grand purpose, not as part of a larger plan, just because the adventures are what they do. Because getting in the ship together is the specific and irreplaceable thing that exists between them, and always has. And it turns out that thing is enough to organize a life around, even after everything else has been stripped away. Rick, the man who built a civilization and abandoned it, who engineered the multiverse and surrendered it, who spent decades in pursuit of a revenge that emptied him when it arrived. What keeps him going in the end is a 14-year-old boy and a ship, and the next destination neither of them has been to yet. The nihilism says this should not be enough. The nihilism says the ship is just matter moving through space, and the boy is just a biological arrangement of cells, and the destinations are just locations in an indifferent universe that does not know or care that Rick Sanchez is on his way. Rick gets in the ship anyway. Every time. He has never stopped. That is not nihilism. That is a man who found inside the philosophy he built to survive his losses a small and stubborn and completely unkillable thing that the philosophy was never quite able to reach. Not a grand meaning, not a cosmic purpose, just this, just the next adventure, just the person sitting next to him in the ship, just enough to keep going. And that, when you look at it clearly, when you strip away every layer of performance and philosophy and genius and grief and all the brilliant, exhausting, decades-long effort Rick has put into convincing himself and everyone around him that nothing matters, that is who Rick Sanchez has always been. A man who cannot stop caring no matter how hard he tries. And with that, we have arrived at the end of the journey through Rick's nihilism. But before we close out, there is one final thing to do, and that is to pull every thread we have followed across these 12 sections back together and look at the full picture of what the show has been building all along. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.